I arrived at the cabin on a damp, overcast afternoon that felt more like an invitation to vanish than a promise of solace. I had left behind a life crowded with echoes of heartbreak and urban clamor, hoping that the embrace of the Willamette National Forest would finally allow me to stitch together the broken fragments of my spirit. My name is Evelyn Cross, and what I experienced in those ancient pines still lingers in my mind like a half-remembered dream, a dream too vivid to dismiss as mere fancy. The drive from Eugene had been long and reflective, my thoughts swirling with both anticipation and a kind of weary resignation. I'd purchased the cabin with the fervor of someone desperate to reclaim lost parts of herself, yearning for the solitude that only isolation could offer. Nestled among towering evergreens and blanketed by the soft hum of a world untouched by modern chaos, the cabin seemed to whisper promises of renewal. Yet, as I stepped out into the chill of the forest air, I sensed that the pines were not silent custodians of tranquility, but vigilant witnesses to secrets older than time. The first night was a delicate balance between wonder and unease. I sat on the creaking porch, a mug of weak coffee in hand, watching the interplay of twilight and shadow. I was trying to settle into the rhythm of my new life, one measured by the rising and setting of the sun, by the rustle of leaves, and the distant cry of a night bird. But even then, I could not escape the subtle disturbance that prickled at the edges of my awareness. There, amid the soft chorus of the forest, were whispers. At first, I assumed it was the wind threading its way through the branches, but soon I discerned a pattern, an almost deliberate cadence that mimicked the inflections of my own thoughts. I paused, heart quickening, wondering if solitude had conjured voices from the depths of my grief. Yet, something in the cadence suggested they were not my own musings at all. The following morning, I embarked on the ritual of inspecting the area around my cabin. The forest was breathtaking, its greens deep and mysterious, its air perfumed with damp earth and resin. I wandered along a narrow dirt trail, notebook in hand, eager to record observations and perhaps capture the elusive poetry of nature. But as I walked, I noticed an oddity, a set of footprints, too large and deliberate to be those of a deer, imprinted in the soft mud near the base of a towering pine. They were arranged in a way that suggested purposeful pacing, as if someone, or something, had been watching, trailing behind me in the stillness of dawn. I told myself it was likely the work of a local animal, but an icy shiver slid down my spine, and I hurried back to the safety of the cabin. Days merged into nights, and each twilight brought its own unsettling symphony. I found myself increasingly drawn to the strange sounds in the forest, the murmured conversations that seemed to echo my private sorrows and fears. I began to document these occurrences in a battered journal, convinced that they were connected to the spirit of the woods. Late one evening, while the rain tapped a gentle staccato against the roof, I sat by a flickering lantern reading old folklore, collected from dusty library volumes and local accounts. That's when I stumbled upon a reference to a skinwalker, a shape-shifting entity whispered about in the annals of Native American legends. The description resonated disturbingly with the subtle hints I'd observed, an intelligence behind the footprints, a presence that knew my every thought. Was it possible that the forest was home to something far older and more malevolent than I had ever imagined? One particular evening, as dusk bled into night, the forest around me seemed to hold its breath. I remember sitting in the living room, the only sound the soft crackle of the fireplace and the occasional sigh of the wind. The lantern's glow cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and in that play of light and dark, I thought I saw movement, a fleeting silhouette slipping between the trees. My heart pounded as I rose and moved to the window, straining to catch a glimpse in the growing darkness. The figure was there, a dark shape that melted into the blackness as soon as I acknowledged it. I felt a compelling urge to follow, to understand if it was a figment of my wearied imagination or something real, something alive. My next day was consumed by an unsettling curiosity. I ventured deeper into the forest, determined to trace the origins of the strange carvings I had begun to notice on the bark of ancient trees. These marks were not random scratches or the marks of passing wildlife. They bore an uncanny precision and a deliberate pattern, almost as if etched by a hand guided by a long-forgotten ritual. The symbols were archaic, reminiscent of sigils used in old protective rites, yet their meaning eluded me. The more I examined them, the more I felt an oppressive weight, as if the very trees were mourning a terrible secret. With each new marking, my anxiety grew, intermingled with a writer's desire to uncover and record the truth behind the unknown. I spent many restless nights poring over local legends and historical accounts, my small cabin library expanding with books and articles on regional folklore. I contacted an elderly historian in a nearby town, whose tales of the land were imbued with the wisdom of generations. He spoke of old rituals, of spiritual guardians of the forest, and of entities that straddled the boundary between myth and reality. His words were both a comfort and a curse. Comfort in the shared belief that I was not entirely alone in my strange experiences, and a curse in that they hinted at a darkness that might be far too deep to confront head-on. The isolation, which I had once sought as a balm for my wounded heart, was slowly morphing into a crucible of fear and uncertainty. I began to notice that everyday objects around the cabin were not as they should be. A photograph I distinctly remembered hanging on the wall was found turned face down on the floor. A cherished journal that chronicled my journey seemed to have its pages rearranged overnight, as if an unseen hand had meddled with the words. These occurrences escalated gradually, each instance a small fracture in my sense of reality. I started to suspect that the entity, a nameless, shifting presence, was growing bolder, encroaching upon the very sanctity of my solitude. One particularly harrowing night, when a tempest raged outside and the forest howled with ancient fury, I was awoken by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The voice was not singular, but a chorus of murmurs that echoed the long-forgotten lament of the pines. I clutched my blanket, paralyzed with both fear and a perverse curiosity. In that moment, I felt as if I were teetering on the brink between the world of the living and the realm of restless spirits. The storm outside was relentless, as if it sought to wash away the veil that separated us, and for one agonizing hour I lay awake, listening to the forest speak in tongues of sorrow and malice. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline freshness in the air, but the unease it had stirred within me remained. Determined to regain control over my life, I began to research protective charms and ancient rites, piecing together fragments of lore from disparate cultures. I fashioned talismans from twine, small pieces of wood, and even bits of native sage that I found growing wild near the cabin. I hung these tokens by my windows and around the doorframe, hoping to ward off the encroaching malevolence. I even attempted to create a barrier with salt along the perimeter of my little haven, a ritualistic gesture steeped in superstition but offering a glimmer of hope. Yet, despite these measures, the forest continued its silent onslaught. At dusk, when the light waned and the boundaries between shadow and substance blurred, I would often catch a glimpse of a figure, too tall and too lean to be human, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The creature never approached close enough to reveal its true form, always staying at the periphery of my vision, as if content to observe from a distance. Each sighting left me more conflicted, a part of me fearful of the unknown, while another part, the part that had once sought solitude, yearned to understand and even befriend the spirit of the wilderness. I began to record these encounters meticulously, not just in my journal, but with sketches and even audio recordings whenever I dared to venture outside at night. I wanted to capture every nuance of its presence, every creak of the floorboards that might betray an intrusion from another realm. Some nights I would sit for hours, eyes fixed on the darkened tree line, listening for that familiar dissonant murmur of voices that seemed to echo my innermost thoughts. It was during one such vigil that I experienced an encounter that would forever change my understanding of the world around me. It was a night much like any other, with a heavy silence pressing down on the forest as the moon hid behind brooding clouds. I sat by the window, the amber glow of a candle the only defiance against the oppressive dark. The air was unnaturally still when, suddenly, the whispering returned, clearer this time, as if someone was speaking directly to me. I rose, heart hammering, and stepped outside into the cool embrace of night. The forest floor was soft beneath my boots, the darkness almost palpable, a living entity that seemed to breathe around me. I followed the sound, my pulse quickening with every step. The murmurs led me to a clearing where the trees seemed to form a natural amphitheater. In the center stood a massive oak, its trunk scarred with deep, deliberate incisions. The markings were unmistakable, symbols that pulsed with a malevolent energy, reminiscent of the legends I had read. I reached out to trace one of the carvings, and as my fingers brushed the rough bark, a surge of cold fear washed over me. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, layered and insistent, as if the tree itself were crying out in anguish. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as the forest around me seemed to close in, every shadow a potential threat. For a long moment, I stood frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and an almost magnetic pull to understand what was unfolding. It was then that I realized this was not an isolated phenomenon. This was the forest speaking, communicating its ancient sorrow and wrath. The realization filled me with both dread and a strange, newfound determination. I could no longer be a passive observer. If the forest chose to reveal its hidden depths and darker truths, then I had to be willing to confront them, even if it meant facing an entity that defied all rational explanation. In the days that followed, I dedicated myself to learning more about the lore surrounding the pines and the mysterious figures that haunted them. I scoured local archives, pieced together interviews with longtime residents, and even corresponded with a few scholars specializing in indigenous mythologies. Each new fragment of information painted a picture of an ancient pact between the land and its guardians, beings that could traverse the boundaries between the human and the supernatural. According to these accounts, my cabin was built on land that was once sacred, a place where the old ways still held sway, and where nature's voice could be both a guide and a warning. Armed with this knowledge, I resumed my nightly vigils, now with a cautious sense of purpose rather than dread. I continued to document the phenomena, my notes filled with both meticulous observations and raw, unfiltered emotions. I wrote of the feeling of being watched, of the inexplicable warmth that would occasionally seep into the cold night air, and of the small, almost imperceptible shifts in the forest's mood. Every detail was recorded, as if by understanding the patterns of the forest's behavior, I might somehow unravel the mystery of the presence that had chosen to linger in my new home. It was during one of these nights, as the wind whispered through the pines like a chorus of long-forgotten voices, that I encountered the presence once more. This time, it seemed almost tangible. I was in the midst of reading aloud a passage from an old myth when I noticed that the words I had spoken were being repeated softly back to me, not in my own voice, but in a deep, resonant timbre that carried centuries of sorrow. I froze, the pages of my book fluttering in the sudden gust that had nothing to do with the unsettled weather. I spoke, tentative and unsure. "Who are you?" The silence that followed was profound, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, came a single word, a word that felt like a command, echoing in the depths of my soul. "Remember." I do not know if that was a plea, a threat, or an invitation to delve deeper into the mysteries of the land, but from that moment on, I knew my fate was intertwined with the spirit of these pines. I began to embrace the notion that I was meant to be here, that my suffering and isolation were the price I paid to unlock the secrets that had been hidden beneath layers of bark and time. I continued to stay, steadfast in my resolve, even as the uncanny occurrences grew in intensity. I filled page after page with my experiences, my fear, my wonder, and my determination to unearth the truth behind the whispers that haunted my nights. Over time, the forest's presence seemed to adopt a rhythm, a cycle of tension and uneasy calm. There were nights when the entity was nearly imperceptible, a distant murmur or a fleeting shadow, and other nights when it made its presence known with unsettling clarity. I began to notice that the carvings on the trees were not static. They appeared to shift subtly, as if guided by an unseen hand rewriting the ancient script of the forest. My protective charms, once a source of comfort, now felt like fragile tokens in the face of an overwhelming force that was as much a part of the land as the towering pines themselves. In those long, solitary nights, I often found myself reflecting on the irony of my situation. I had come here seeking escape from the pain of a broken heart, only to find that the forest's ancient wounds were far more palpable than my own. Yet, in that pain, there was a strange kinship. I began to see that the forest, with all its whispered secrets and restless specters, was a mirror of my own inner turmoil, a living testament to the scars left behind by time and loss. And so, I resolved that I would not leave until I had learned all I could from the land's spectral inhabitants, until I had understood the meaning behind the repeated command to remember. Months have passed since that fateful stormy night, and I continue to document every moment, every whisper, every fleeting glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I have come to accept that the forest is not my enemy, but a complex living tapestry of memory and myth, a force that both heals and haunts, offers solace and demands sacrifice. I have even started incorporating my experiences into my writing, blending raw emotion with the surreal tapestry of the natural world, hoping that one day my words might serve as a guide to others who, like me, have found themselves at the crossroads of the known and the unknowable. There are still nights when the whispers intensify, when the forest seems to speak in tongues, and I stand at the window, heart pounding, questioning whether I am truly alone. But I have learned to listen, to let the voices of the pines wash over me, and to accept that every rustle, every shadow, is part of a dialogue that transcends fear and enters the realm of understanding. In these moments, I feel less like a solitary wanderer and more like a participant in an ancient ritual, a keeper of secrets that the forest has guarded for generations. Looking back, I realize that my journey into isolation was not an escape from life's sorrows, but an immersion into the raw, unfiltered truth of existence. I have come to see that the beauty of the natural world is inseparable from its mysteries, that every whisper in the dark holds a lesson, and every presence, no matter how malevolent, carries a story waiting to be told. My cabin in the Willamette National Forest is no longer merely a refuge from the pain of a broken heart. It is a living narrative, an ongoing dialogue between my inner self and the ageless spirit of the pines. Now, as I sit at my desk with a pen in hand, gazing out at the dark silhouettes of ancient trees, I am filled with a profound sense of acceptance. I have learned to live with the whispers, to let the echoes of the forest be a part of my daily rhythm. I have installed my protective charms and carried out the rites I learned from the old legends, and though the forest remains unpredictable and enigmatic, I have found a balance between fear and curiosity, between solitude and communion. I know that there will be nights yet to come when the shadows grow long and the whispers become a chorus of unseen voices, when I will feel the weight of history pressing in around me. But I also know that I have the strength to face whatever comes, armed with the knowledge that I am part of something far larger than myself, a continuum of memory and myth that transcends time and grief. And so, I remain here, not as a prisoner of isolation, but as a dedicated chronicler of the mysteries that dwell among the pines, committed to preserving the legacy of a land that has, in its own inscrutable way, healed me. As I write these words, I feel the faintest brush of a cool wind on my cheek, and, for a moment, I am certain that it carries a message, a gentle reminder that I am not alone, that the forest is always listening, always waiting to share its ancient secrets with those willing to listen. In this communion between my heart and the wild, I have found a kind of solace, an understanding that the echoes of our pasts, however painful, are the very threads that weave the fabric of our existence. And so, I continue on this journey, penning down each moment, each whisper, as both a record of my trials and a tribute to the enduring spirit of the land. I have come to love these woods, not despite their mysteries, but because of them. They have taught me that life is a delicate dance between light and darkness, joy and sorrow, clarity and the unknown. The pines have whispered their stories to me, and in return, I have shared my own. And though the forest remains a realm of perpetual secrets, I know that as long as I am here, I will always have a voice that echoes among the ancient boughs, resilient and unyielding, just like the enduring spirit of the wild. I am Evelyn Cross, a solitary writer among the pines, and this is my testament to the mystery, the terror, and the profound beauty of living in the embrace of nature's uncharted heart. I never imagined that running away from the flames, both literal and metaphorical, would lead me to a place where the past and present collided in ways I couldn't have foreseen. I was once a firefighter, a man whose life was measured in alarms, heat, and the relentless pursuit of saving lives. But after years of watching devastation and tragedy pile up like so much burning rubble, I found myself exhausted, burned out not just by fire, but by the weight of it all. So I sold everything, left behind the adrenaline and the sirens, and sought refuge in a small off-grid homestead tucked away near Silver Falls, just outside North Bend, Washington. I craved a quiet life, one where the only heat was that of a wood stove, and the only alarms were the call of a distant bird at dawn. The drive up there was something of a farewell to my old self. I remember the highway stretching out beneath a slate-gray sky, the sound of my own breathing mingling with the hum of the engine. As I neared the falls, the landscape shifted from manicured suburban sprawl to the rugged, unyielding beauty of the Pacific Northwest. There was an ancient quality to the towering cedars and ferns, as if they had borne silent witness to centuries of secrets. I pulled off the road onto a gravel path that led to my new home, a modest, weathered cabin that had seen better days but held the promise of a fresh start. From the moment I stepped onto the property, I felt an odd mix of liberation and apprehension. The first day was spent in the practical business of settling in, clearing brush, testing the old generator, and figuring out the quirks of an off-grid existence. But as dusk fell and the forest took on a different hue, the peace I'd craved began to fray at the edges. I recall sitting on the back porch, a cup of strong coffee in hand, watching the silver mist roll off the cascading falls in the distance. The sound of the water was both soothing and unsettling, a ceaseless roar that somehow masked quieter, more insidious sounds beneath. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. I'd be tidying up inside the cabin when I'd catch a faint sound in the background, a giggle, or perhaps a whisper of laughter that didn't belong to any person I knew. At first, I chalked it up to the wind playing tricks among the trees, a byproduct of the isolation and the constant hum of nature. But soon the phenomenon became too persistent to ignore. Late in the evening, as I sat at the rickety kitchen table reading by the light of an oil lamp, I distinctly heard the patter of little feet on the wooden floor, as if a group of children were racing through the room. I spun around, half expecting to see a prankster or even a stray animal, but found nothing, only the creeping shadows that the flickering lamp cast along the walls. I began to wonder if the isolation was doing something to my mind. After all, the quiet can be maddening if you let it. But then there were the moments when I'd step outside and see silhouettes near the tree line, small, fleeting figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. One morning, while checking the generator, I glimpsed a cluster of children playing near the edge of the property. Their forms were blurred, their laughter distant, as if coming from another time altogether. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something else entirely. My instincts, honed by years of facing danger head-on, told me that this was no mere hallucination. The next few weeks turned into a slow, disquieting dance between normalcy and the uncanny. I busied myself with repairs around the cabin, ensuring that the old structure could stand up against the relentless Pacific Northwest weather. The solitude, once a balm for my soul, was now punctuated by these eerie encounters. I started to document every odd occurrence, keeping a worn leather journal on my desk where I recorded the time, the sound, and the location of each inexplicable noise or fleeting figure. I even set up a basic camera system near the back porch, hoping that modern technology might provide some rational explanation. The footage, however, was inconclusive. There were moments of static and brief glimpses of movement, but nothing that definitively explained the phenomena. One night, as a cold rain battered the cabin, I found myself huddled by the wood stove, trying to push away a creeping sense of dread. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes and carrying with it an almost human lament. I had just read a battered local history book, one of those dog-eared volumes that documented the legends and tragedies of the area, when I came across a chapter that sent a chill down my spine. It spoke of a curse tied to the land, a sorrowful tale of children lost to the merciless grip of time, their spirits condemned to wander the forests around Silver Falls. The narrative was vague and steeped in folklore, yet it resonated deeply with the strange occurrences I had been experiencing. Could it be that my quiet refuge was, in fact, haunted by the echoes of a tragic past? The more I delved into local records and spoke with a few longtime residents in nearby towns, the more convinced I became that there was a story here, a story that had been left untold by time. I met an old man at a small diner in North Bend, his eyes clouded with memories as he recounted whispered legends of ghostly children who appeared near the falls. He spoke of sorrowful faces that turned from innocence to despair, of voices that carried the weight of ancient grief. I listened, both skeptical and intrigued, my rational mind warring with the growing evidence that something unexplainable lurked in the mists. Determined to understand what was happening on my property, I began to research the history of the homestead. The cabin, it turned out, had once been part of a small settlement that had met with a sudden, unexplained end. There were hints in old newspapers and local archives of a series of mysterious disappearances and untimely deaths in the area. Some said that the land had been cursed ever since a bitter tragedy befell the settlement, one involving a group of children whose lives were cut short under murky circumstances. I wasn't one for superstition, but the pieces were coming together in a way that was hard to ignore. Every night, as the darkness deepened and the sounds of the falls mingled with the rustle of the forest, I felt the presence of those lost souls growing stronger. One particular evening remains etched in my memory with stark clarity. I had just finished a long day of repairs and was preparing for bed when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of children laughing. This time, however, the laughter was not distant or ethereal. It seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. My heart pounded as I traced the sound to the hallway, where I found something impossible. Faint handprints smeared in a damp substance on the wall. The prints were small, too small for an adult, and they led from the door of the master bedroom down the hall and out into the living area. I stared at them in disbelief, my mind racing through explanations that none of them felt satisfactory. I cleaned them off, hoping that if they were the result of some prank or natural phenomenon, they would disappear. But they left me with a gnawing certainty that I was not alone. I started to take measures, practical steps that I had learned as a firefighter. I secured the cabin as best I could, reinforcing doors and windows, and even installed motion sensors that would trigger alarms when movement was detected in the hallways. I recorded every anomaly, every creak and whisper. But despite my efforts, the phenomena only grew more frequent and more disturbing. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before dawn, I would awaken to the sound of a child's sobbing, so soft that I wasn't sure if it was a dream or a memory. Other times, I would catch a glimpse of a pale face reflected in the window, only to find nothing there when I turned around. The turning point came one rain-soaked night that seemed to stretch into infinity. I was lying awake on a creaky cot in the spare room, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof lulling me into a restless vigil, when the door creaked open slowly. I sat up, heart hammering, as a cold gust of wind swept into the room. There, in the doorway, stood a figure, a small, almost translucent child with eyes that shimmered with sorrow and an expression that oscillated between innocence and something far more malevolent. The child said nothing, but its eyes spoke volumes of a pain that transcended time. I felt a compulsion to reach out, to comfort this lost soul, yet every instinct screamed at me to flee. The figure lingered for a few heartbeats that stretched into eternity before vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind an echo of a whisper that I could barely decipher, a word that sounded like remember. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a message, a plea to uncover the truth of what had happened here, and perhaps to right a wrong that had persisted long after the original tragedy. My nights were no longer defined by fear alone. They were consumed by a desperate need to understand. I began to scour local records with a fervor I hadn't felt in years, determined to piece together the fragments of a story that had been buried by time and neglect. I interviewed neighbors, old-timers who had grown up hearing ghost stories, and even reached out to a local historian who specialized in the lore of the Pacific Northwest. The historian told me of an old settlement that had once thrived near Silver Falls, a community that had been marked by inexplicable misfortunes, culminating in a series of deaths that were never fully explained. Among the scattered accounts was the tragic tale of a family who had lost several children to a mysterious illness, or perhaps something far more sinister. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I decided that I could not simply hide from the past any longer. I set up a more sophisticated array of cameras around the cabin and the nearby forest, hoping that modern technology might capture evidence of the spectral children. Nights turned into a blur of static and fleeting images, frames that showed ghostly silhouettes flitting between trees, and at times a face that seemed to peer directly into the lens with eyes full of anguish. I spent hours poring over the footage, my rational mind clashing with the mounting evidence that something beyond explanation was at work here. The emotional toll was heavier than I'd anticipated. I'd always prided myself on my resilience, honed over years of battling raging infernos and life-threatening situations. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for the relentless intrusion of sorrow that seeped into every corner of the cabin. I began to question whether I had made a grave mistake by choosing isolation. The very thing I had hoped would heal my battered soul was now a stage for a recurring nightmare, one in which the innocent and the damned were intertwined in a cycle of grief and despair. In a moment of quiet desperation, I recalled the old adage that sometimes the only way to banish a ghost is to acknowledge it. With trembling resolve, I gathered my notes, my recordings, and the fragments of history that I had collected, and I set out to confront the past head-on. I returned to the exact spot where I had seen the child in the doorway, a small clearing near the edge of the property, where the forest seemed to open up to the roar of the falls. I sat down on a weathered log and spoke aloud, telling the unseen presence that I knew of their sorrow, that I was here to listen if they wanted to share their story. The wind stilled for a moment, as if in reluctant agreement, and then, in a voice that was barely more than a murmur, the word "remember" echoed through the trees once again. That single word became a mantra, a key that unlocked a torrent of memories both personal and ancestral. Over the following weeks, I embarked on a series of nightly vigils at the clearing. I lit a small fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the ancient bark of nearby trees, and I talked, sometimes to the empty air, sometimes to the silent witnesses that surrounded me. I recounted my own losses, the pain of a life spent battling fire and tragedy, and in doing so, I felt a strange kinship with the invisible voices that filled the night. In those moments of raw vulnerability, I began to sense that the spirits were not malevolent in the way one might expect from a horror story, but rather trapped echoes of grief, seeking acknowledgement and perhaps forgiveness for the injustices they had suffered. As the cycles of night and day continued, I slowly integrated the haunting into my life rather than fighting against it. I learned to accept that the presence of these spectral children was as much a part of the landscape as the ever-present roar of Silver Falls. I maintained my daily routines, fixing the cabin, foraging for supplies, and keeping meticulous records of every unusual occurrence. But my nights were now dedicated to bridging the gap between the living and the lost. I began to experiment with small rituals, simple gestures that combined the practical knowledge I'd acquired as a firefighter with the ancient wisdom gleaned from local lore. I arranged wildflowers and small tokens in a makeshift memorial near the clearing, a humble offering meant to honor the memories of those who had passed on. There were nights when the presence was gentle, a soft hand on my shoulder, a fleeting glimpse of a child's smile that flickered like a candle in the darkness. And there were nights when it was overwhelming, when the cabin seemed to vibrate with sorrow, and the sound of children's laughter turned to anguished cries. On one such night, when the rain had turned to a torrential downpour and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, I sat alone in the living room, the light of the oil lamp trembling in my grasp. The walls of the cabin, once a sanctuary from the outside world, now bore cryptic etchings that I hadn't noticed before, symbols and words that hinted at a ritual, a desperate plea from a time when life was fragile and hope was scarce. I traced my fingers over the markings, feeling the chill of history seep into my bones. I wondered if these were the echoes of an ancient curse, or simply the residue of a grief too profound to be forgotten. In those long hours of isolation, I began to see parallels between my own internal struggles and the spectral torment of the children. Both of us had been caught in circumstances beyond our control, a relentless series of events that had left scars invisible to the eye but searing to the soul. I realized that my journey here was not merely an escape from the chaos of my past, but an inadvertent commitment to confronting a legacy of pain that spanned generations. Every creak in the floor, every unexpected giggle in the dark, was a reminder that some wounds run deeper than time itself. I recall one particular evening vividly. I had returned from a day of repairing a sagging roof beam, my muscles aching with fatigue, only to find that the front door had been left ajar. I stepped inside cautiously, the air inside the cabin heavy with an unspoken tension. In the living room, where I had left my tools and a half-read book, I saw what looked like tiny footprints leading from the door to the base of the grand stone fireplace. The footprints were delicate, almost childlike, and they disappeared into a corner of the room where the shadows pooled thickly. I followed them, my pulse rising, until I reached an old family portrait that had hung above the mantel. A portrait of the original inhabitants of this homestead. The eyes in the painting seemed to follow me, filled with an expression of sorrow that mirrored the spectral faces I had seen. For a moment, I felt a profound connection, as if the history of the place was reaching out to bridge the gap between then and now. In the aftermath of that discovery, I began to experiment with bridging that gap. I started recording my nightly encounters, not just for evidence, but as a way to communicate. I would speak aloud, inviting the children to share their story, their pain. "I'm here," I'd say, my voice echoing off the rough-hewn walls. "I want to understand." And sometimes, in the quiet moments that followed, I'd hear a soft reply, a whisper of thanks, or perhaps an echo of sorrow. It was as if the act of acknowledging their presence allowed a tiny crack in the barrier between our worlds to open, if only for a moment. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in my daily life, but the duality of my existence, by day, a man fixing a cabin and tending to the necessities of off-grid living, by night, a reluctant intermediary between the living and the lost, became increasingly difficult to reconcile. My neighbors, sparse as they were, noticed the change in me. I wasn't the same hard-edged, no-nonsense former firefighter they remembered. I had grown quieter, more introspective, as if weighed down by a burden that could not be seen but was felt in every step I took. Yet, despite the isolation and the haunting presence that pervaded my nights, I found a strange solace in the act of documenting these experiences. It was as though the very process of recording each detail was an act of defiance against the creeping despair. I spent countless nights by the banks of Silver Falls, the roar of the water merging with the spectral chorus overhead. I began to notice that the pattern of the apparitions seemed to follow a certain rhythm, one that was almost musical in its repetition. There were nights when only one child would appear, their eyes glimmering with a mix of mischief and melancholy. Other nights, a small group would gather, their presence collectively filling the space with an eerie energy that left me both unnerved and oddly comforted. I began to refer to these gatherings as visits, as if I were hosting long-lost family members who had come to reclaim their place in the narrative of this land. In time, I learned to navigate the dual realities that now defined my existence. I accepted that the echoes of the past were not here to torment me, but to remind me that life, no matter how ordinary or chaotic, was a tapestry woven from threads of joy, sorrow, and everything in between. I started to set aside time each evening to tend to a small ritual of remembrance. I would light a candle, place a small token, a carved piece of wood or a wildflower, near the window, and silently offer a thought or a prayer for those who had been lost. It became a quiet ritual, one that allowed me to reconcile the fiery part of my past with the cold, reflective melancholy of the present. There were moments, however, when the line between communication and intrusion blurred dangerously. One night, as I sat at the window, a gentle knock echoed from the front door. I opened it with trepidation, half expecting to see a neighbor or a wayward traveler. Instead, I found no one there, only a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the step. The paper bore a hastily scrawled message in a child's handwriting. "Help us remember." I stared at it, heart pounding, feeling as if the plea was meant specifically for me. I tucked the note into my jacket pocket, unsure whether it was a message from the beyond or a cruel prank. But in that moment, it cemented my resolve to unearth the history of this place, to give voice to the silent tragedies that had seeped into the very foundations of my new home. As the weeks turned into months, I became more proactive in my investigation. I compiled every scrap of information, old photographs, faded letters, newspaper clippings, and laid them out on a makeshift board in the corner of my living room. I studied the layout of the original settlement, the names of the families, and the timeline of events that led to the downfall of a community once filled with laughter and hope. The more I learned, the more I felt compelled to act as a bridge between the worlds. I reached out to local groups dedicated to preserving the history of the area, and even enlisted the help of a medium who claimed to communicate with those who had passed on. The medium, a quiet woman with eyes that seemed to see beyond the veil, confirmed many of my suspicions. In hushed tones, she described a deep sorrow that had settled over Silver Falls, a lingering pain that refused to fade even with the passage of time. One particularly vivid session with her left me with a clear, if unsettling, directive. The spirits needed acknowledgement, not exorcism. They were not here solely to haunt, but to remind the living of a past that had been abruptly severed from its natural course. That revelation, coming from someone I'd initially dismissed as a charlatan, shifted something within me. I began to see my role not as a lone defender against a malevolent force, but as a caretaker, someone tasked with bearing witness to a tragedy, and, perhaps, offering a chance for healing. Even as I embraced this purpose, there were nights when the haunting became almost unbearable. One such night, the rain fell in relentless sheets, the wind screaming like a chorus of mourning souls. I huddled by the window in the darkened living room, my breath visible in the icy air, when a sudden, piercing cry shattered the silence. It was the cry of a child, raw with agony and despair, echoing off the walls and freezing my blood. I rushed outside, calling out into the storm, desperate for a sign of who or what might be in pain. For a few long, agonizing minutes, the only response was the ceaseless roar of Silver Falls and the patter of rain. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the cry ceased. In its place, I found a small, abandoned doll lying in the mud at the edge of the clearing. A doll with eyes too lifelike for comfort. I picked it up gingerly, feeling its weight in my hands, and in that instant, I knew that the spectral children were not content with mere whispers or fleeting appearances. They were reaching out, demanding that their story be told. I spent that night in a state of restless determination. I cradled the doll as I returned to the cabin, and as I sat by the flickering light of my oil lamp, I wrote down everything I could recall about that cry and the doll's appearance. I made a silent promise to uncover the truth, to restore a measure of dignity to those who had been forgotten by time. I realized that my life, once dominated by the physical battles of firefighting, had now taken on a new mission, one of reconciliation between the living and the departed. Each day, as I worked on repairs or ventured into the nearby woods, I carried that responsibility with me, a quiet resolve that every lost voice deserved to be heard. Slowly, as autumn deepened and the air took on a crisp, foreboding chill, the disturbances began to recede into a kind of uneasy truce. The laughter and cries still came, but there was an undercurrent of calm, as if the spirits had accepted my presence and my efforts to remember. I continued my nightly rituals, the candlelight dancing with the shadows of the trees, and I found that the overwhelming sense of dread was gradually replaced by a respectful melancholy. I still missed the frantic pace and tangible dangers of my old life, but I had come to understand that the quiet here was not empty. It was filled with memories and lessons that I needed to learn. Now, as I sit in my small cabin with the rhythmic murmur of Silver Falls in the distance, I reflect on the unexpected path that led me here. I am no longer the hardened firefighter who once charged headlong into flames, but a man transformed by the realization that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with water or fire, but with empathy and remembrance. The ghostly visits, the spectral laughter, and the cryptic messages scrawled in the dark have woven themselves into the tapestry of my daily existence. They serve as constant reminders that life is a fragile interplay between light and shadow, joy and sorrow, and that every soul, whether living or lost, deserves to be acknowledged. I continue to document everything, each whispered laugh, and every fleeting glimpse of a pale face in the rain. I know there will be more nights of despair and moments when the weight of the past nearly overwhelms me, but I also know that I have been given a unique opportunity to make a difference, a chance to bring peace to those who have long wandered these woods, trapped by memories too painful to let go. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mists swirl around the towering trees and the world seems suspended between dreams and reality, I feel a deep, abiding connection to the land and its tragic history. It is in those moments that I truly understand the delicate balance between mourning and healing. I have learned that to truly honor the past, one must be willing to confront its shadows head-on, to listen to the voices that echo in the darkness, and to remember that even the most broken spirits can find solace in being seen. I stand as both witness and guardian, a man whose own scars have been soothed, if only slightly, by the gentle acceptance of those who once had no voice. And though I know that the haunting of Silver Falls may never fully vanish, I have come to see it as a part of the land's soul, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the healing potential of empathy. As I close my journal tonight, the rain begins to ease, and the first hint of dawn creeps over the horizon. I set the doll back near the window with a quiet nod of farewell, knowing that its silent vigil continues even as I sleep. I am Marcus Reed, and my journey here has been as much about rediscovering who I once was as it has been about honoring those who can no longer speak for themselves. In the interplay of falling water, whispering winds, and the gentle chorus of spectral voices, I have found a semblance of peace, a fragile, ever-changing peace that is as bittersweet as the memory of a child's laughter on a rainy day. And so I remain, a solitary man at the edge of a roaring waterfall, committed to the task of remembrance. Each day, I wake with a sense of purpose, knowing that I am part of a larger story, one where the past is never truly gone, and where every lost soul is given the chance to be remembered. In this quiet, haunted corner of the world, I have learned that the flames of yesterday can forge the strength of tomorrow, and that healing, however elusive, is found in the delicate act of listening to the voices carried on the wind. I know that the echoes of Silver Falls will continue to call out in the dark, and I also know that as long as I am here, I will answer that call, pen in hand, heart open to the lessons whispered by the fallen. This is my story, a story of loss, of courage, and of the unexpected beauty found in the midst of sorrow. It is a testament to the fact that even in the quietest, most isolated corners of the world, the voices of the past can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and remind us that every soul, no matter how lost, deserves to be remembered. I still remember the first time I truly listened to the wind in these mountains. I arrived at the farmhouse on an unremarkable, mist-laden morning that felt less like a destination and more like a calling. My name is Liam Hart, and until recently, I had known life only as a military medic, a world of rigid protocols, urgent chaos, and the quiet agony of watching life flicker and fade in the line of duty. When personal tragedy drove me to seek solace far from the clamor of urban existence, I traded that regimented life for something quieter, something that might allow me the space to mend. I chose this converted farmhouse nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains near Asheville, North Carolina, believing that the majesty of nature and its timeless rhythms would offer me a kind of healing that the sterile halls of hospitals never could. I arrived on a day that seemed to be carved out of an old folk ballad. The morning light filtered softly through dense fog, and the hills rolled on forever, cloaked in layers of emerald and mist. As I stepped onto the creaking porch, I felt both a sense of liberation and an inexplicable shiver, as if the land itself acknowledged my arrival. The farmhouse, weathered by years and echoing stories of its own, stood with a quiet dignity, that made me feel both insignificant and deeply connected to a larger tapestry. I spent the first day unpacking memories in cardboard boxes and planning for a slow, deliberate life where I might finally confront the ghosts of my past in peace. My first nights here were deceptively calm. I would sit by the window, a steaming mug of coffee warming my calloused hands, and watch the sky shift from a pale blue to a bruised violet as dusk settled over the mountains. But as darkness deepened, an unsettling quiet would creep in, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of things unsaid. One such night, I awoke to the sound of an almost imperceptible moan drifting through the open window. I sat up, heart pounding, convinced it was merely the wind among the pines. Yet, as I listened, the sound took on a timbre that was strangely mournful, as if it were a lament born of ancient sorrow. I dismissed it at first as my imagination conjuring memories of long-lost battles and hardships, but deep down, I sensed that these mountains held secrets far older and darker than my own misfortunes. In the days that followed, I began to notice little oddities that tugged at the edges of my rational mind. A creak in the floor when I was alone, a rustle outside that wasn't made by any creature I recognized, and, most disturbingly, a series of guttural howls echoing across the ridges on moonless nights. It wasn't until I uncovered an old journal tucked away in a dusty drawer, its pages filled with looping handwriting and grim sketches, that I realized these occurrences might have more than a natural explanation. The journal belonged to a previous occupant, a man who had written of encounters with a creature that haunted these hills, a being that was described in local lore as part man, part beast, reminiscent of a Wendigo from ancient Native American legends. I couldn't help but feel that I was not alone, that I had unwittingly become a character in a tale of myth and menace. It started with the howls. One night, as I lay in bed trying to drown out the persistent beating of my own heart, a sound shattered the silence, a bone-deep howl that rolled over the mountains like a spectral tide. I sat bolt upright, listening as the sound echoed from distant hollows and then seemed to draw nearer, as if it were circling the farmhouse. I could almost sense a presence outside, lurking in the tree line, watching with eyes that I could not see. I told myself it was nothing more than an echo of my own inner turmoil, but deep down, I knew that these were not the howls of any ordinary creature. They carried a weight, a hunger that felt as ancient as the very mountains themselves. The next morning, the chill from that encounter clung to me as I ventured out to inspect the surrounding land. The dew-laden grass and the crisp mountain air did little to soothe my rising anxiety. I found myself scanning the forest with a careful, almost military precision, a habit ingrained from years of service. But what I discovered made my pulse quicken in a different, more primal way. In a clearing not far from the farmhouse, I stumbled upon strange markings carved into the bark of an old oak. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before, swirling lines and jagged strokes that seemed to pulse with a hidden meaning. I couldn't decipher them, but they resonated with the descriptions from the journal. My mind raced with possibilities, ancient rituals, protective sigils, or warnings etched by those who once knew of the dark presence that prowled these hills. My nights became a relentless blend of sleep and uneasy wakefulness. I began keeping a meticulous log of every unusual sound, every shift of shadow in the corner of my eye. I'd pace the creaky floorboards of the farmhouse in the wee hours, half expecting to come face to face with the thing described in the journal. My dreams, once filled with fragmented memories of firefights and frantic rescues, transformed into vivid, harrowing visions. In one recurring nightmare, I was pursued through a labyrinth of twisted trees by a gaunt figure, its eyes burning with a cold, unyielding hunger. I could feel its breath on my neck, its skeletal hand almost brushing my skin. The terror in those dreams was so palpable that I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if it were trying to escape from within me. The turning point came on a storm-lashed night that seemed to merge the fury of nature with the fury of something supernatural. Thunder rolled over the ridges, and lightning illuminated the dense canopy in ghostly flashes. I had spent the day trying to repair a leaky window, an annoying but necessary chore when living off the grid in a place where nature was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. As night deepened, the storm intensified, and I found myself huddled in the cramped living room with only the flicker of an old oil lamp to guide me. The wind howled in a way that set my nerves on edge, and amid the chaos of rain and thunder, I distinctly heard footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate. I crept to the window, peering out into the inky darkness, and saw a fleeting silhouette that made my blood run cold. For a moment, the shape of a man, but with an unnatural twist, a slouched posture, limbs that seemed too long, and a gaze that hinted at something feral, stared back at me from the edge of the property. Then, as if swallowed by the storm, it vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity from my nightmares had stepped into the realm of reality, that the journal's tales were not mere folklore, but a living, breathing menace. The days that followed were a blur of fear and fascination. My mind, ever analytical from my military training, began piecing together the fragments of local legends I'd heard in passing since arriving. I scoured libraries, poring over books of folklore and old newspaper clippings that recounted unexplained disappearances and strange sightings. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that this creature was a remnant of something primal, a being that emerged when the natural order was disrupted, a dark counterpoint to the vibrant life of the Blue Ridge. I reached out to locals who still remembered the old stories, and, in hushed tones over cups of bitter coffee at a small diner in Asheville, they spoke of eerie figures that roamed the mountains, of unexplained howls that heralded misfortune, and of warnings passed down from one generation to the next. Their accounts varied in detail, but shared an unmistakable commonality, a presence that defied reason, a force that lingered in the shadowed corners of the woods. In an effort to protect myself, and perhaps to understand, I began to learn the rituals and practices that these old folks swore by. I attended a small gathering in a cramped community center on the outskirts of town, where an elderly woman, whose eyes seemed to have seen too many winters, taught me how to use sage and iron to ward off what she called the hungry darkness. I took her words to heart, even as I found the rituals both foreign and oddly comforting. I gathered bundles of sage from the forest and fashioned small sachets, hanging them by the door and windows, hoping that the smoke might serve as a barrier between me and the unknown. I even fashioned a crude talisman from an old horseshoe and a bit of braided leather, a token, a small gesture of protection against the relentless unknown. Despite my precautions, the disturbances only grew bolder. One crisp autumn evening, as the wind whispered secrets through the golden leaves, I sat on the creaking porch, notebook in hand, trying to capture the beauty of the sunset as it bled into twilight. The air was cool and smelled of earth and decay, a reminder that even in beauty, nature held a somber truth. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel, pacing slowly along the edge of the property. I strained my eyes in the dimming light, but all I saw were shifting shadows and the trembling branches of a nearby oak. Yet, I felt it, a presence that moved with deliberate purpose, as if it were stalking me even in the fading light. My heart hammered in my chest, and I remained still, barely daring to breathe until the sound faded into the night. Then came the night that irrevocably altered my perception of what lurked beyond the veil of the visible world. I had retired early, exhausted from a day of labor and deep introspection, and the fatigue of my recent nightmares had rendered sleep a reluctant visitor. In the dead of night, as I lay curled in a threadbare blanket on an old cot, I was jolted awake by a sound that was both familiar and otherworldly, a low, almost inaudible chant that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the farmhouse. I sat up, listening intently, and realized that the chant was in a language I couldn't decipher, its cadence rhythmic and unsettling. It felt like a summons, a call that stirred something deep within me, as if the mountains themselves were urging me to remember long-forgotten truths. Compelled by a mixture of dread and a profound need to understand, I rose and followed the sound out of the safety of my room, down the creaking stairs, and out into the stormy night. The rain fell in torrents as I made my way toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. The air was electric with the charge of impending revelation. I reached a clearing where the moon's feeble light struggled against the oppressive darkness, and there I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was half hidden in shadow, its features obscured by a ragged hood and a face that seemed both human and grotesquely distorted. I couldn't tell if it was beckoning me or warning me away, but in that moment I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on my soul. I wanted to run, to retreat back into the relative safety of the farmhouse, yet I was inexplicably rooted to the spot, as if compelled by a force beyond my control. I whispered a hesitant greeting into the howling wind. "Hello? Who's there?" The figure did not respond with words, but the chant in the distance seemed to swell in volume, its resonance mingling with the sound of the storm. The moment stretched on, a heartbeat of eternity, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissipated into the darkness, leaving me alone with the ceaseless roar of the rain and my own pounding heart. That encounter shattered the fragile barrier I had maintained between logic and the mystical. I returned to the farmhouse that night with a head swirling with questions and a resolve that was as firm as it was frightened. I began to document everything in painstaking detail, the sounds, the sights, even the sensations that I experienced. I recorded my dreams and my waking moments, hoping that through careful analysis I might find a pattern or a clue to the true nature of the force that haunted these mountains. The journal from the previous occupant now seemed like a cryptic map, guiding me toward an understanding of an ancient darkness that had been stirred awake by my very presence. In the weeks that followed, I embraced a dual existence. By day, I worked to restore the farmhouse, its weathered timbers and creaking floors slowly coming back to life under my careful hands. I tended a modest garden, harvested what little produce the rocky soil offered, and even began to appreciate the simple rhythms of rural life. The Blue Ridge, with its sweeping vistas and quiet majesty, slowly seeped into me, mending the fractures of my past. But by night, the landscape transformed into something altogether more sinister, a realm where every rustle in the brush and every distant howl was a reminder that I was sharing this space with something far beyond mortal comprehension. I found solace in small rituals, a kind of nightly communion with the land. Each evening, as twilight surrendered to darkness, I would take a slow, measured walk through the property, lighting a lantern and allowing the gentle glow to guide me along familiar paths. I'd pause at a clearing by a babbling creek, where the sound of water over stone provided a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. There, I would speak softly into the night, sharing memories of loss, of love, and of the deep wounds that had brought me to this remote corner of the world. In those moments, the wind seemed to answer, carrying back a quiet murmur that felt like a benediction from the earth itself. My nights grew richer with both terror and wonder, as I began to perceive subtle changes in the atmosphere. The howl that once rang out like a death knell became, on occasion, a melancholic lament, a sorrowful cry that resonated with the pain of a long-forgotten past. The old journal's sketches of the Wendigo-like creature took on new significance as I pieced together my experiences with local lore. I recalled the stories I had been told by elders in Asheville, stories of a creature born of winter's cruelty and starvation, a being that haunted the fringes of civilization, emerging when the balance of nature was upset. Though I had once dismissed such tales as superstition, now I could not ignore the parallel between the legend and the reality that unfurled around me. One particularly frigid evening, as a biting wind whipped through the mountain passes, I sat huddled in the farmhouse's modest kitchen, the fire in the old cast-iron stove crackling like the pulse of the earth. The wind's mournful song outside was punctuated by a sound that made me freeze, a slow, deliberate scraping at the back door. I edged toward the doorway, half expecting to see an animal seeking shelter, but when I opened it, there was nothing there but the swirling snow and a set of deep, claw-like scratches etched into the wood. I stood there, the chill of that silent accusation seeping into my bones, and realized that the creature was no longer confined to the shadows of my nightmares. It had begun to mark its presence in the physical world, leaving traces that I could no longer deny. In the days that followed, I redoubled my efforts to learn from the mountain's wisdom. I reached out to a local herbalist who lived on the outskirts of town, a quiet woman with deep-set eyes and an unspoken understanding of the land's secrets. Over cups of bitter tea brewed from wild herbs, she explained that the mountains were not only a place of beauty, but also a repository of ancient energies. The land remembers, she told me softly, her voice carrying the weight of countless winters. And sometimes it calls to those who are open enough to listen. The creature you sense is part of that memory, a guardian, perhaps, or a reminder that even the most remote corners of the world hold echoes of past sorrows. Her words, though cryptic, offered me a measure of comfort. They suggested that my struggle was not solely against an external force, but also a journey toward reconciling the fragments of my own wounded soul. I began to incorporate her insights into my nightly walks. I would gather wild herbs and recite old invocations, words that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. I don't know if these acts had any real power, but they brought me a sense of purpose, a feeling that I was contributing to a dialogue between the present and the past. In those sacred moments, the oppressive fear that had once gripped me began to yield to something more complex, a blend of reverence, sorrow, and the hard-won hope that healing was possible, even in the face of ancient darkness. There were nights, however, when the creature's presence became almost unbearable. I recall one such night with crystal clarity, a night when the sky was a tapestry of inky blackness, punctured by jagged forks of lightning. I had taken refuge on the back porch, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, trying to steady my trembling hands as I scribbled down the day's events. Suddenly, from somewhere deep in the woods, came the unmistakable sound of heavy, labored breathing, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. I rose slowly, compelled by a mix of dread and a deep need to confront the terror head-on. As I stepped off the porch, a figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the clearing. It was the creature from my dreams, a gaunt, imposing figure with eyes that burned like cold embers and a presence that seemed to draw the warmth from the night. For a few agonizing moments, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. I felt my pulse racing, my every instinct screaming to run, yet I found myself rooted to the spot, compelled to witness this living embodiment of the mountain's ancient grief. In that moment, as lightning illuminated its twisted form and thunder roared overhead, I realized that the creature was not merely a monster from folklore, but a living reminder of the harsh, unforgiving cycles of nature, a cycle in which every being, no matter how monstrous, played its role. After what felt like an eternity, the creature melted back into the darkness, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the echo of its presence. I returned to the farmhouse in a daze, my mind reeling from the encounter, yet a part of me felt oddly at peace, as if I had been given a glimpse into a truth that transcended fear. That night, I resolved to no longer hide from the mountain's mysteries, but to engage with them. I began a disciplined regimen of studying local legends, combining what I learned from the elderly herbalist with my own experiences recorded in a leather-bound journal. I practiced quiet meditation at dawn, allowing the crisp mountain air and the soft murmur of the creek to wash over me, to cleanse the residue of fear that had clung so stubbornly to my soul. Slowly, I started to see patterns emerging in the chaos of my nightly encounters. The creature's appearances, though sporadic, seemed to follow a certain cadence, almost as if it were drawn to moments when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. I began to suspect that my presence here, in this remote farmhouse, was not a mere accident, but part of a larger tapestry woven by fate and the relentless passage of time. Every scratch on the door, every unnatural howl in the dead of night, was a thread in a story that had been told long before I arrived. A story of survival, loss, and the enduring power of nature's raw, unyielding spirit. In the quiet solitude of my days, I found that the mountains offered both solace and challenge. I mended fences, cleared paths, and tended to the small garden with the same care I once reserved for wounded comrades on the battlefield. Each act of restoration was a small defiance against the encroaching darkness, a statement that life, in all its fragile beauty, was worth the struggle. And as I labored under the wide, open sky, I felt a quiet kinship with the land, a bond forged not of blood, but of shared resilience and the understanding that even in the depths of despair, there was a promise of renewal. Now, as I sit by a crackling fire in the twilight of another long day, I reflect on the journey that brought me here, a journey that has been as much about confronting the darkness outside as it has been about reconciling the shadows within me. I have come to accept that the Blue Ridge Mountains, with their soaring peaks and hidden hollows, hold mysteries that defy explanation. The creature that stalks these lands is no mere figment of legend, but a manifestation of the natural order, an echo of a time when life and death, beauty and terror, were entwined in an eternal dance. I do not claim to have all the answers, nor do I expect the darkness to vanish entirely. Instead, I have learned to live with it, to honor it as part of the delicate balance that sustains this rugged land. Each night, when I light my lantern and step out into the quiet, starlit expanse of the Blue Ridge, I do so with a sense of humility and resolve. I know that the mysteries of these mountains will continue to challenge me, to force me to confront my deepest fears and most cherished hopes. And in that confrontation, I find a strange solace, a reminder that healing is not the absence of pain, but the courage to stand in the face of it, and, somehow, to grow. This farmhouse, these mountains, and even the haunted presence that stalks the shadows have become a part of me. I carry their stories within my heart, etched into my very being like the ancient carvings on the bark of the oak. In the interplay of light and darkness, of whispered legends and the harsh reality of survival, I have found a way to reconcile my past with the promise of tomorrow, and, as I write these words by the warm glow of the fire, I feel a quiet certainty that no matter what the night may bring, I will continue to listen to the wind, to the whispers of the trees, and to the persistent, enduring call of the Blue Ridge. I am Liam Hart, a man forged in the crucible of duty and loss, now wandering these timeless mountains in search of understanding. Here, in the embrace of nature's grandeur and its unfathomable mysteries, I have discovered that even the darkest shadows can yield to the gentle persistence of hope. Every step I take along these rugged trails is a step toward healing, a journey that is as much about mending a broken heart as it is about facing the ancient, relentless forces that whisper from the depths of the night. In the end, the Blue Ridge Mountains have taught me that life is an ever-unfolding narrative, a blend of beauty and terror, of love and loss. And while the specter of that gaunt, ravenous presence may still roam these hills, I have come to see it not as a curse, but as a reminder of nature's indomitable will, I remain here, not as a victim of fate, but as a quiet observer and participant in the eternal story written in the language of wind, stone, and shadow. And so, as the fire dwindles and the stars reclaim the night sky, I close my eyes with the comforting thought that in this vast, mysterious wilderness, I have finally found the space to be both vulnerable and strong. In the echoes of the Blue Ridge, amid the whispers of ancient trees and the silent testimony of rugged peaks, I have learned that to truly live is to embrace the full spectrum of existence, its fleeting moments of beauty, and its inevitable encounters with the dark. Here, in the cradle of these timeless mountains, I continue my journey, pen in hand, heart open to every secret the wind might carry. I am Liam Hart, and this is my truth, a truth etched into the very soul of the Blue Ridge, where every dawn brings a promise of renewal, and every dusk reminds me that even in the face of the unknown, hope endures. I first set foot in Appalachian Hollow on a chilly October afternoon, when the sky seemed to be painted with the soft, muted hues of a watercolor, blush pinks, dusty oranges, and hints of gray that promised both beauty and mystery. I had left behind the frantic pace of urban galleries and the constant, unyielding buzz of city life in search of a haven where I could finally listen to my own heartbeat and, perhaps, rediscover the true essence of my art. My name is Ivy Malone, and I have always believed that art is not merely something one creates, but a dialogue between one's inner soul and the world around. I arrived with my easel, my paints, and a head full of dreams, ready to transform this remote Appalachian cottage near Roanoke, Virginia, into my sanctuary, a place of unbridled creativity and solace. The cottage was modest and weathered, nestled among rolling hills draped in autumn's fading splendor. The building, with its creaking wooden floors and time-worn stone chimney, whispered stories of generations past. I felt an inexplicable pull as I stepped inside. It was as though the very walls were welcoming me, inviting me to share in their secrets. The first few days were a blissful whirlwind of setting up my studio, arranging canvases by the large, wavy windows that framed breathtaking views of the surrounding hills, and letting my imagination run wild on blank canvases. There was an immediacy to the beauty here, the way the sunlight danced through the leaves, the gentle murmur of a creek in the distance, and even the occasional flicker of power outages that reminded me that nature reigned supreme in this secluded retreat. Yet, almost imperceptibly, the cottage began to reveal a side that was as enigmatic as it was unsettling. It started with small anomalies that I attributed to the quirks of an old building. I would return from a long, solitary walk in the crisp mountain air, only to find that a painting I'd left drying overnight had inexplicably shifted. At first, it was nothing more than a smudge or an odd streak, a hint of something that didn't belong to the scene I had so lovingly created. But as nights passed, I began to notice more disturbing details. Figures and shapes, dark and indistinct, appeared in the background of my landscapes. In one painting of a serene autumn forest, a shadowy figure with eyes that seemed too real for comfort hovered just behind a stand of birch trees, its presence both haunting and sorrowful. I initially chalked it up to my overactive imagination, a side effect of the isolation and the intense introspection that came from living off the grid. Still, each morning, as I unrolled a fresh canvas, I would find that the remnants of these nocturnal intrusions were there, etched in unexpected places. It was as if someone, or something, had taken a silent interest in my work, altering my brush strokes when I wasn't looking. I began to document these changes meticulously in a leather-bound journal, noting the time, the light, and the mood of each painting. The more I observed, the more I sensed that there was an underlying narrative at work, a story that transcended the ordinary act of creation. Late one evening, as a gentle rain drummed softly on the roof and the fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the worn wooden floors, I sat alone in my studio, contemplating these inexplicable changes. I wondered if the spirit of the place might be communicating with me through my art. My mind drifted to the local legends I had heard during a brief conversation with an elderly neighbor when I first arrived. They spoke in hushed tones of a vengeful witch, a spectral presence said to roam the hills of Appalachian Hollow, a woman wronged long ago whose spirit was condemned to wander and curse those who dared to disturb her rest. The idea seemed ludicrous at first, the sort of folk tale one might dismiss as superstition, and yet the uncanny alterations in my work began to mirror the eerie descriptions of this legend. Eyes that burned like embers, a hint of twisted sorrow in every shadow, and an overall sense of an ancient, unresolved anger. In the days that followed, my nights were filled with restless dreams and long hours spent poring over old records at the local library. I pored over brittle newspapers, musty county records, and even sought out the stories of long-time residents who claimed to have seen things they could not explain. Their narratives were varied, a tapestry of heartache, betrayal, and the inescapable power of an old curse. One elderly woman, whose voice trembled as she recalled the past, told me of a time when a young woman had been wronged by those she loved, a woman whose beauty and artistic spirit had been scorned until she vanished without a trace. The locals believed her spirit had transformed into something dark and vengeful, a guardian of the hills who would punish anyone who dared to intrude upon her domain. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I listened, torn between the skepticism of a modern mind and the undeniable pull of ancient lore. Determined to understand what was happening in my cottage and in my art, I began a series of nightly vigils. Armed with a small lantern, my sketchbook, and an open heart, I would wander the winding paths that led from my cottage into the heart of the surrounding woods. The moon hung low, casting long, silvered shadows on the forest floor as I moved slowly among the gnarled trees. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an owl, but beneath those natural sounds I sometimes caught whispers, a voice that seemed to be woven into the fabric of the night. The voice was barely audible, yet laden with a sorrow that made my heart ache. I would pause, straining to catch its words, but they always dissolved into the night before I could decipher them. The experience left me both unnerved and inexplicably hopeful, as if the spirit of the land was trying to reach out to me in its own enigmatic language. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled like a chorus of ancient voices and the rain pounded against the windows with a ferocity that shook the very foundation of the cottage, I experienced something I can only describe as a turning point. I had been awakened by the sound of a soft, persistent tapping at the window. Bleary-eyed, I shuffled to the pane and peered out into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, a gaunt, sorrowful face framed by unruly hair and eyes that glimmered with an otherworldly light. Before I could fully process what I had seen, the face vanished into the storm, leaving me trembling in the silence that followed. I felt an overwhelming urge to respond, to speak aloud in recognition of this spectral presence, yet my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I retreated to my studio, my mind buzzing with the possibility that the legends were more than mere stories, that the spirit of the wronged woman might be lingering near, trying to communicate. The next morning, when the storm had subsided to a damp, gray drizzle, I discovered something that both terrified and fascinated me. One of my canvases, a piece I had been particularly proud of, a sweeping landscape of the rolling hills bathed in autumn light, had been altered overnight. In the upper corner of the painting, where I had left a blank expanse of sky, a figure had appeared. It was a spectral silhouette of a woman, her features indeterminate yet undeniably present, her eyes seeming to hold an accusation I could neither ignore nor understand. The figure was not painted in any style I had used. It was raw, almost as if scratched in by a desperate hand. My heart pounded as I traced the lines with trembling fingers, and in that moment I realized that my art had become a conduit, a bridge between my world and a realm that was both ancient and tormented. I spent the following days in a state of anxious wonder. I experimented with my canvases, deliberately leaving spaces open and inviting, almost as if beckoning the mysterious presence to make itself known. Each night, I would leave a canvas propped near the window, watching with bated breath to see if the figure would reappear or if new symbols would manifest. And, as if in response to my silent invitation, subtle changes continued to emerge. A swirl of mist where none had been, a glint of light that suggested eyes watching from beyond the visible. These alterations were not violent or overtly malevolent. Rather, they carried an air of tragic melancholy, as though they were the remnants of a soul long confined by pain and regret. My sleep became fragmented by dreams filled with unsettling imagery. I would find myself in vast, empty rooms painted in shades of twilight, where a lone figure, a woman with the same sorrowful eyes, roamed silently. In these dreams, she seemed to be searching for something, her gaze piercing through the darkness as though trying to reclaim a part of herself lost to time. I awoke each morning with a lingering sense of longing and an inexplicable need to understand her story. It was as if her pain had seeped into my very being, entwining with my own creative spirit. I began to wonder if my move to Appalachian Hollow was not simply an escape from the chaos of urban life, but a summons, a call to bear witness to a tragedy that demanded to be acknowledged. Compelled to act, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the folklore of the region. In a small, cluttered office adorned with sepia photographs and yellowed manuscripts, he recounted tales that echoed the legends I had heard from the locals. According to him, the curse of the vengeful witch was not merely a myth, but a fragment of a long, bitter history, a story of betrayal, lost love, and a desire for retribution that had festered for generations. He told me of a young artist, much like myself, who had once inhabited the very cottage I now called home. That artist, he claimed, had fallen in love with a man whose promises were as transient as the autumn mist, and when her love was spurned, she had been driven to madness. In the throes of despair, she had invoked a dark force, cursing the land so that her sorrow would forever stain the hills. Her spirit, bound by the curse, was said to manifest in the creative endeavors of those who dwelled in the hollow, a silent plea for recognition and redemption. I left his office with a heavy heart and a mind teeming with questions. Was it possible that I had unwittingly inherited the burden of her legacy, that my art was now a battleground, where her grief and my desire for expression were locked in a silent struggle? The realization unsettled me, but it also ignited a fierce determination. I resolved to engage with the spirit, not as an adversary to be exorcised, but as a wounded soul whose pain I might help soothe through the universal language of art. One cool, starlit night, I prepared a small ritual in the clearing behind the cottage, a circle of smooth stones arranged around a low burning fire. I had spent weeks reading about ancient rites and local customs, and though I was not one to believe blindly in superstition, I felt that a gesture of acknowledgement might bridge the gap between our worlds. As I sat in the circle, the flames casting flickering patterns on my skin, I spoke aloud in a gentle, measured tone. I see you. I feel your sorrow. Let us share this pain and transform it into beauty. For a long moment, the only response was the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a presence stirred at the edge of the clearing, a faint figure that hovered among the trees, its features indistinct, but its eyes unmistakably present. I could not see her clearly, yet I felt her gaze piercing through the veil of darkness. as if she were both judging and welcoming me. I offered no plea or command, only a quiet invitation to communicate. In the days that followed that ritual, the manifestations in my art took on a new quality. The spectral images became less erratic and more intentional, as though the spirit was now collaborating with me rather than intruding uninvited. I began to experiment with my technique, incorporating the motifs that had once terrified me: swirling mists, somber eyes, and delicate, ghostly outlines into my work. The process was cathartic and transformative. Every brush stroke felt like an act of healing, not just for the spirit that haunted these hills, but for a part of myself that had long been wounded by abandonment and loss. I found solace in the interplay of light and shadow on the canvas, in the way that beauty and sorrow coexisted in a delicate balance. Yet, even as I embraced this strange partnership, there were moments when the presence of the past became overwhelmingly real. On one particularly cold morning, I awoke to the sound of soft weeping echoing through the cottage halls, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I wandered through the rooms, following the plaintive sound until I reached the small attic where I had stored old canvases and relics of my previous life. There, in a dusty corner illuminated by a lone shaft of light, I found a tattered portrait of a young woman whose eyes mirrored the same sorrow I had seen in my dreams. I felt a sudden kinship, as if this portrait were a mirror reflecting a fragment of my own soul. The discovery filled me with an indescribable melancholy, and for the first time, I allowed myself to weep openly, releasing a torrent of emotions that had long been bottled up inside me. In the weeks that followed, my connection with the spectral presence deepened. I began to incorporate elements of ritual into my daily routine: a whispered prayer before each painting session, a moment of silence to acknowledge the unseen, and even a delicate offering of wildflowers left on the windowsill, as if to invite the spirit to share in my creative process. The local legends no longer felt like distant folklore, but a living, breathing part of my daily existence. I learned to differentiate between the intrusive, chaotic flashes that had first unsettled me and the quiet, soulful moments when the spirit's presence felt like a comforting embrace, a reminder that I was not alone in my struggle to find meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent. One crisp evening, as twilight descended and the world was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea and my journal open on my lap. I had just finished a new series of paintings, a collection that, to my surprise, captured the evolution of my inner journey. The canvases depicted a progression from darkness to a fragile luminescence, a visual narrative of despair gradually giving way to hope. As I traced my finger along the pages of my journal, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly and saw, in the gathering dusk, the unmistakable figure of a woman standing at the edge of the yard. This time, her form was more distinct, an ethereal silhouette with hair that seemed to flow like liquid night, and eyes that held centuries of sorrow and longing. For a long moment, we regarded each other in silence, as if in mutual recognition. I offered a tentative smile and a soft greeting. "I'm here. I hear you." The figure did not speak, but in that silent exchange I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, a merging of our stories, our grief, and our desire for redemption. It was as if, in that single moment, the boundaries between the living and the lost had blurred, and I became a willing participant in a narrative that spanned time and pain. I cannot say for certain if that was the turning point that lifted the curse, but over the ensuing months, the oppressive energy that had once clung so tightly to Appalachian Hollow began to recede. The power outages still occurred, and the winds still whispered secrets through the ancient trees. But there was a newfound harmony, a delicate accord between the spectral and the living. I continued to paint, each stroke a deliberate act of collaboration with the unseen muse. My art evolved into a testimony of reconciliation, a canvas upon which sorrow was transformed into beauty, where the cursed past was reimagined as a source of creative energy rather than a weight of despair. In quiet moments of reflection, I realize that the journey has been as much about reclaiming my own voice as it has been about honoring the memory of a long-forgotten soul. The haunting presence, once a source of dread, now stands as a silent mentor, guiding my hand and my heart through the murky waters of grief and isolation. I have learned that the line between madness and genius is thin, and often blurred by the interplay of light and darkness, and that the scars we bear can become the very brushstrokes that define our art. Appalachian Hollow, with its rugged beauty and hidden sorrows, has become a part of me, a canvas upon which both the past and the present are painted in hues of resilience and hope. Now, as I sit by my window and watch the slow dance of autumn leaves in the gentle breeze, I feel a profound gratitude for the journey that brought me here. I still recall the nervous excitement of my first days in this remote haven, the quiet terror of unexplained changes in my canvases, and the soul-stirring moments when the spectral presence seemed to reach out in silent communion. Each memory is woven into the tapestry of my days, a reminder that our creative endeavors are never truly solitary, that even in isolation we are connected to a larger, mysterious story. I have come to understand that the curse of Appalachian Hollow was never a curse at all, but rather an invitation, a call to delve deeper into the recesses of my own soul, and to transform that darkness into something luminous. The woman whose sorrow once haunted these hills now lives on in my art, her legacy a gentle reminder that healing is possible even in the midst of loss. I have learned to honor the past by embracing it, to allow my brush to speak the unspoken truths of both pain and beauty. In doing so, I have found not only a refuge for my creativity, but a deeper connection to the spirit of this ancient land. My days continue in a gentle rhythm of painting, reflection, and quiet rituals. I rise with the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees, and I spend long hours in my studio, the world outside melting away as I immerse myself in color and form. Evenings are reserved for moments of stillness, when I sit on the weathered porch, listen to the murmur of the creek, and allow the wind to carry away the remnants of the day's trials. And sometimes, when the air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the promise of rain, I feel her presence once again, a gentle caress on my shoulder, a fleeting glimpse of an eye in the twilight. These moments remind me that I am not alone, that the spirit of Appalachian Hollow is as much a part of me as the blood that flows through my veins. In the soft cadence of the passing seasons, I have learned that life is a series of transformations, a continuous evolution where every ending is simply a prelude to a new beginning. The ghost of the past that once cast long shadows over my art now serves as a muse, infusing each piece with a depth of emotion that I had never known before. My canvases have become my confessions, my declarations of resilience, and my celebrations of the intricate dance between sorrow and beauty. Appalachian Hollow is no longer a place of eerie isolation, but a vibrant, living gallery where every rock, every tree, and every whispered legend contributes to the unfolding masterpiece of my life. I have also come to see that the true magic of art lies not in its ability to capture a single moment frozen in time, but in its capacity to transform pain into something transcendent, a shared language that speaks to the depths of the human spirit. And so, I continue to paint, to listen, and to honor the invisible forces that shape my destiny. I remain here in this secluded corner of the Appalachian Hills, my heart open to the silent conversations that echo through the corridors of time, and my brush ever ready to capture the fleeting beauty of both the seen and unseen. As dusk settles and the stars emerge one by one in the inky sky, I find myself at peace, wrapped in the knowledge that my journey, fraught with mystery, heartbreak, and unexpected wonder, has led me to a place where I can finally be both vulnerable and whole. In the interplay of shadow and light, in the transformative power of art and memory, I have discovered that every brushstroke, every whispered legend, is a testament to the enduring spirit of creation. And so, with my heart as my guide and my art as my legacy, I continue to embrace the bittersweet symphony of Appalachian Hollow, forever grateful for the strange, beautiful, and sometimes haunting path that brought me here. I am Ivy Malone, and in the quiet, wild expanses of these ancient hills, I have found not only a home, but a canvas for my soul, a space where every ghost, every secret, and every lost hope can be transformed into something luminous, something profoundly human. This is my truth, painted in shades of sorrow and hope, and it is a story that I will continue to tell, one brush stroke at a time. I remember the day I drove off the beaten path like a line of code, finally compiling without error, a moment of quiet triumph that marked the beginning of my new life. I had been an engineer for most of my adult years, a man who found solace in the order of numbers and the precision of calculations. Yet, beneath the surface of spreadsheets and structural plans, I had grown tired of the relentless hum of a corporate life that left little room for genuine wonder. So, with a mixture of trepidation and resolve, I traded boardrooms for a reclaimed cabin perched on the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains, near Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I envisioned a life where each day would be measured not in deadlines and deliverables, but in sunrises and the soft cadence of nature. I was determined to construct a reality from scratch, a world built not on concrete and steel, but on the raw elements of the earth and my own aspirations. The first few weeks were a study in contrasts. By daylight, I immersed myself in the rhythms of off-grid living, repairing the aging structure of my cabin, establishing a modest solar setup, and foraging for local produce. The work was satisfying in a way that no office project had ever been. Every task was tangible, every repair a testament to my own hands. Yet, even as I found a new kind of order in the chaos of nature, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that there was something ineffable about this place, a residue of memories and sorrow that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of perception. My first unsettling sign came unexpectedly one morning. I had been exploring the perimeter of my property, a disciplined trek along the tree-lined trails that skirted the edge of the park. My eyes, trained by years of scrutinizing blueprints and circuit diagrams, caught sight of something peculiar near the foundation of my cabin. A series of antique photographs, wedged into a crevice in the weathered wooden siding. The images were sepia-toned portraits of people whose expressions ranged from somber resignation to quiet anguish. I couldn't recall ever having seen these before, and they bore the unmistakable air of history, a history that seemed to seep into the very walls of my new home. I took the photographs inside, examining them with the methodical curiosity of someone accustomed to problem-solving. Who were these people? What had become of them? And why had they been left behind in a place where nature now reclaimed every corner? That same night, as darkness fell like a heavy curtain over the Smokies, I set up my modest array of cameras and sensors around the cabin, a habit I had developed in my engineering days. I wasn't a superstitious man, but I believed in documentation, in gathering data to understand phenomena that defied immediate explanation. I hoped to capture evidence of what I suspected was merely an effect of aging structures or local wildlife. Instead, my instruments recorded fleeting bursts of light in the forest, shapes that danced between the trees in patterns too deliberate to be random. I reviewed the footage on my laptop, each frame meticulously scrutinized, and found the images hauntingly clear. Silhouettes of figures moving in slow, measured steps along the tree line, their forms barely perceptible against the dense backdrop of ancient pines. At first, I rationalized it as the play of shadows in the moonlight, but a nagging doubt began to gnaw at the edges of my reason. As days melted into weeks, I found myself increasingly caught between my innate pragmatism and the mounting evidence that something beyond conventional explanation was at work here. The photographs, the captured silhouettes, and the unaccounted-for lights all pointed to a presence, something that seemed to be tethered to this land. I began to comb through local historical records, searching for any reference that might link the images to the past. My visits to the nearby town of Gatlinburg introduced me to local historians and old-timers who spoke in measured tones of tragedies long buried beneath layers of time. One story, in particular, echoed in my mind, a tale of a community that once thrived in these valleys, only to be decimated by a series of unexplained misfortunes. They spoke of families lost to mysterious circumstances and of unresolved grief that, like an echo, still resonated in the Smokies. I couldn't help but wonder if the photographs I'd found were remnants of that past, a silent record of souls who had been here long before I arrived. I continued my daily routines with a growing sense of duality. By day, I repaired, maintained, and explored the practicalities of living off the grid. I engineered fixes for the quirks of an old cabin, replacing corroded wiring and calibrating my solar panels to capture every stray beam of sunlight. My technical background lent me comfort in these tasks. Every problem had a solution. Every glitch could be debugged. Yet at night, I felt the boundary between the tangible and the spectral blur. I began to experience moments of déjà vu, a flash of memory that wasn't my own, like brief intrusions of another's sorrow and longing. Sometimes, in the stillness just before sleep, I could hear what sounded like distant voices murmuring through the trees. Other nights, I awoke to the faint scent of an old perfume, as if someone from a bygone era had brushed past me in the dark. One night, I decided to confront these anomalies head-on. I sat in the dim glow of my study, the hum of my computer, and the soft whir of my recording devices filling the silence. With a notepad in hand, I began to write down every detail I could recall from the previous night, the timing of the sounds, the precise direction from which they seemed to come, the texture of the air. It was an exercise in clinical observation, yet every scribbled note carried an undercurrent of something ineffable, a deep-seated sorrow that defied logical categorization. I spent hours rewatching the footage from my cameras, pausing each frame, marking the exact moment when a figure would appear and then vanish into the darkness. I was beginning to see a pattern, subtle yet persistent, a sort of spectral choreography that seemed to repeat night after night. The breakthrough came on a cold, clear night when the moon hung low and luminous over the Smokies. I was reviewing the latest batch of recordings when I noticed something odd. In one particular clip, a figure stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, its face turned towards the cabin. Unlike previous fleeting images, this one lingered for nearly a minute before fading. I zoomed in, my heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and scientific curiosity. The face was indistinct, but I could make out the contours, a look of profound sadness etched into its features. It wasn't a face of terror or malevolence. It was a face that seemed to carry the weight of endless loss. I replayed the clip over and over, each time feeling as if the figure was silently beckoning me, urging me to understand its story. That night, I couldn't sleep. I gathered my gear, a digital camera, a voice recorder, and my notebook, and ventured outside. The crisp air stung my cheeks as I walked along the narrow path leading to the clearing where the figure had been recorded. The night was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. I reached the spot and stood motionless, trying to attune my senses to any sign of movement. Time seemed to stretch out in slow motion, every second an eternity of anticipation. And then, just as I was about to dismiss the sensation as a trick of my mind, I saw it, a movement at the periphery of my vision. I turned quickly, and there, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight that broke through the canopy, was the same spectral figure. It stood on the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on me as if it had been waiting all along. I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a mixture of sorrow, longing, and a desperate need to bridge the gap between our worlds. I spoke softly, my voice trembling slightly. "Who are you? What do you need?" For a long moment there was no reply. The figure remained silent, its eyes locked onto mine, conveying a message without words. Then, as if acknowledging my question, a gust of wind stirred the leaves, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a single word that resonated in the quiet. "Remember." The word echoed in my mind, reverberating through every fiber of my being. In that moment, I realized that I was not merely an intruder in a haunted landscape, but a reluctant custodian of memories that had been buried beneath decades of neglect. The figure's sorrow was palpable, and I understood that its presence was a call to acknowledge the past, to unravel the stories of those who had suffered, and to give them a voice in the present. The days that followed were a blur of investigation and introspection. I sought out local archives and historical societies, poring over records that detailed the rise and fall of communities that had once thrived in these mountains. I discovered accounts of families whose lives had been irrevocably altered by inexplicable tragedies, a series of misfortunes that had left behind only fragments of memory and sorrow. I learned of a particular community that had been decimated by a series of accidents and unexplained deaths, leaving survivors haunted by loss and guilt. The names of those lost were etched in the margins of old newspapers and weathered ledgers, each name a testament to a life abruptly ended. I felt a growing sense of responsibility, as if the echoes of their lives were now intertwined with my own. In the quiet of my cabin, I dedicated myself to documenting every detail. I assembled a wall of clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes that mapped out the history of the land and its people. I spent hours each evening, my desk illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp, cross-referencing dates and names, piecing together a narrative that stretched back into the mists of time. The meticulous process was both cathartic and exasperating. Each new discovery a glimpse into a world of pain, each fragment a reminder of lives that had been snuffed out like candles in a storm. I couldn't help but feel that the spectral figure I had encountered was the embodiment of all that grief, a living memory of loss, determined to be remembered even as the passage of time threatened to erase its story. As autumn deepened into the crisp chill of early winter, the apparitions became more frequent, their presence a constant, if subdued, undercurrent in my daily existence. The phantom figures were not aggressive or overtly hostile. They were sorrowful, almost mournful, as if burdened by the weight of untold stories. I noticed that on nights when the air was particularly still, I would hear soft, almost rhythmic tapping at the window, an unmistakable cadence that reminded me of footsteps on a long-forgotten path. At other times, I would catch fleeting glimpses of a figure moving slowly across the yard, its outline blurred by the falling snow. Each encounter reinforced my belief that these were not random manifestations, but deliberate, almost ritualistic echoes of a past that demanded recognition. I began to hold quiet vigils in the evening, inviting the memories into the space around me. With a notebook in hand and my camera ready, I would sit on the back porch under a quilt of stars, silently calling out to the unseen. "I'm here," I would say softly. "I remember you." The response was never immediate, but over time, I started to sense subtle shifts in the energy around the cabin, a gentler breeze, a softening of the shadows. There were nights when I felt as though the very air vibrated with an unspoken acknowledgement, as if the land itself was whispering its gratitude for the act of remembrance. I also experimented with leaving small tokens near the foundation of the cabin, A faded photograph I had discovered in a local archive, a handwritten note with a name that had appeared repeatedly in the records. I wasn't sure if these acts had any tangible effect, but they filled me with a sense of purpose. It was as if I were piecing together a mosaic of memories, each token a small step toward reconciling the fractured narrative of this haunted place. I began to think of myself not as a lone, off-grid inhabitant, but as a keeper of lost histories, tasked with preserving the echoes of lives that had long since passed into legend. One evening, a particularly frigid night when the wind cut through the trees like a knife, I experienced an encounter that still sends shivers down my spine. I was sitting by the wood stove, the only source of warmth in an otherwise bitterly cold cabin, when I noticed a subtle shift in the room's temperature. At first, I assumed it was the natural draft of winter air seeping through cracks in the old walls, but then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, as if the very fabric of the room exhaled a deep, sorrowful breath. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dim corners, and there, in the mirror that hung above the battered mantelpiece, I saw a reflection that wasn't my own. For just a moment, the reflection of a gaunt, sorrowful face flitted behind me before vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stared at the mirror, heart pounding, trying to rationalize the experience. Yet, even as my logical mind wrestled with the inexplicable image, I knew that I had witnessed something that defied conventional explanation, a direct, personal glimpse into the lingering presence of those long gone. The following days, I resolved to document every anomalous occurrence with a newfound intensity. I installed additional cameras, adjusted my recording devices, and even began keeping a detailed log of the ambient conditions, the temperature, the barometric pressure, the wind speed, hoping to correlate these variables with the appearance of the spectral phenomena. It was a labor of both scientific curiosity and a profound need for closure. Each piece of data, each carefully noted detail, felt like a puzzle piece in a grand mosaic of human sorrow and resilience. In time, my research led me to a startling realization. The apparitions seemed to cluster around certain historical sites, areas where tragedies had unfolded with heartbreaking regularity. One such location was a forgotten cemetery, hidden in a thicket of overgrown pine trees on the outskirts of Gatlinburg. I decided to visit, despite the chill that ran down my spine at the thought of venturing into a place so steeped in grief. The cemetery was a silent testament to the passage of time, a place where weathered headstones and crumbling monuments stood as mute witnesses to lives cut short by fate and misfortune. As I wandered among the graves, I felt a profound sadness wash over me, as if I were intruding upon a sacred space of remembrance. I laid a single white flower on a particularly worn stone, whispering, "I remember," and for a moment, the stillness was broken by a gentle rustling of leaves. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, but it felt as though the very earth had acknowledged my tribute. My work at the cabin and my excursions into local history gradually began to merge into a singular purpose, a mission to restore not just the physical space, but the lost voices of the past. I reached out to local scholars, attended meetings at historical societies, and even started a small blog where I recorded my findings, my encounters, and my reflections. The process was deeply personal. Every entry in my log was a step toward understanding not just the apparitions, but the unresolved grief that had imbued this land. I found that the more I acknowledged the past, the more the presence around me softened, as if the act of remembrance was a balm for old wounds. Now, as I sit here by the crackling fire in my cabin, its glow dancing softly on the worn wood of the walls, I reflect on the journey that brought me to this crossroads of memory and mystery. I have learned that while logic and reason can explain much about the physical world, there are realms of emotion and memory that defy measurement, an energy that persists long after the last breath of a life has faded away. I am Jared Collins, an ex-engineer turned reluctant chronicler of the past, and I have come to understand that sometimes the most profound truths lie in the spaces between what can be calculated and what can only be felt. I continue to document every anomalous occurrence, every soft whisper in the night, and every image that appears on my screens. I know that there will always be mysteries that science cannot fully unravel, and perhaps that is precisely what makes life in the Smokies so compelling. Each day, I wake with a renewed sense of purpose, aware that the land around me carries memories too precious to be forgotten. I have come to see that my cabin, with its hidden photographs and spectral visitors, is not haunted by malevolence, but by the enduring legacy of those who came before me. And as I maintain my meticulous records and tend to my modest home, I feel a deep kinship with the lost souls whose stories I am slowly piecing together. There are still nights when the apparitions are unmistakable, a soft figure in the doorway, a flicker of movement in the peripheral vision, reminding me that I am not alone in this world of shadows and memories. I have learned to greet these moments with a quiet respect, offering a nod of acknowledgement rather than a cry of fear. The voices of the past speak to me in a language that transcends words, a language of remembrance and regret, of love lost and the resilience of the human spirit. In this way, my life has become a delicate balancing act, a fusion of rigorous engineering precision and the soft, intangible poetry of memory. I no longer seek to erase the past, but to integrate it, to let its lessons illuminate the present. And as I prepare for another day in this rugged, beautiful corner of the world, I carry with me the quiet hope that by remembering, I can honor the lives that once were, and, in doing so, create a future that is both informed by history and open to the promise of renewal. I have found that the ghosts of the Smokies are not adversaries to be banished, but echoes to be listened to, a part of the intricate tapestry of life that includes both the tangible and the ethereal. In embracing this duality, I have discovered a sense of peace, a resolve to live fully in the moment while honoring the silent legacies that surround me. And though my work is far from complete, I am no longer the man who left the corporate world seeking escape. I am now a guardian of memories, a custodian of stories, and a man who has learned that true understanding comes from the willingness to listen to the land, to the voices of the past, and to the quiet call of one's own heart. This is my story, etched not in stone or steel, but in the soft, enduring glow of remembrance. As the fire crackles and the night deepens, I continue my vigil, ever watchful, ever curious, ever determined to let the past inform the present. And in that determination, I have found a truth that is as profound as it is simple, that every life, no matter how fleeting, deserves to be remembered, and that in the act of remembering, we keep the light of those who have gone before us burning brightly in the dark. I am Jared Collins, and this is the narrative of my life on the edge of the Smokies, a life measured not in the cold calculus of machines, but in the warmth of human memory, in the soft glow of spectral apparitions, and in the enduring promise that even amidst sorrow, there is beauty to be found. I still remember the exact moment I left behind the frenetic pulse of the city, the day when skyscrapers, sirens, and the unyielding clamor of urban life no longer offered solace, but instead suffocated my restless spirit. My name is Samantha Delgado, and I had spent years shaping cities and planning neighborhoods as an urban planner, convinced that order and design could tame the chaos of existence. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, as I sat alone in my sterile apartment, I began to feel that something essential was missing, a connection to a world more ancient, more raw, more alive. So I packed my few belongings, fueled by a burning need for reinvention, and set off for Redwood Ridge. a remote sanctuary nestled deep within the towering redwoods near Eureka, California. The journey itself felt almost mythic, as if I were stepping through a threshold into a realm where time had slowed and the ordinary rules of life no longer applied. I remember driving along narrow, winding roads flanked by dense groves of redwoods, whose massive trunks rose like the pillars of an ancient cathedral. There was an almost tangible energy in the air, a deep, hushed vibration that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the forest. When I finally arrived at the cabin, a weathered structure perched on the edge of a small clearing, I was overcome by a sense of both liberation and trepidation. Here, in this place that time appeared to have forgotten, I was free to rebuild my life from the ground up. The cabin itself was a patchwork of reclaimed wood and stone, a labor of love constructed by someone who once believed that nature and human ingenuity could coexist in quiet harmony. Yet, from the moment I stepped inside, I sensed that there was more to this place than just the rustic charm of off-grid living. The air felt heavy with history and something else, an undercurrent of tension that I could neither name nor ignore. My first days were consumed by the practicalities of establishing a new life, fixing the leaky roof, setting up a renewable energy system that would power the few lights I'd installed, and learning the idiosyncrasies of life far removed from the predictable schedules of the urban grind. I took comfort in these tasks. They were tangible, measurable, and entirely within my control. But as the days lengthened and the redwood forest settled around me like a living, breathing entity, I began to notice subtle signs that my new sanctuary was not entirely as benign as it appeared. It began on a night when the moon was hidden behind a thick, impenetrable blanket of clouds, a moonless night where darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I was lying awake in my narrow bed, the hum of my makeshift generator a steady lullaby when I first heard it, a deep, rhythmic drumbeat echoing through the vast expanse of the forest. At first, I dismissed it as the sound of a distant logging operation, or perhaps the tolling of some forgotten machinery, but the sound was primal, resonant, and unmistakably deliberate, a cadence that vibrated deep within my bones. Night after night, on the darkest of evenings, that drumbeat returned. It was not constant, but pulsed at intervals, like the measured steps of some ancient ritual. Then there were the symbols. I was out gathering firewood one crisp morning when I noticed something odd on the bark of one of the ancient redwoods that bordered my property. Carved deep into the rough, scarred surface were strange markings, swirling lines and jagged sigils that glowed faintly in the early light, as if imbued with some unspoken power. I could not decipher their meaning. They bore no resemblance to any language or symbol system I recognized from my studies. The markings seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, and I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that they were a warning or invocation, perhaps even a summoning. I photographed them, my hands trembling as I tried to capture the eerie patterns, and later spent hours poring over texts of ancient Californian folklore, searching for a clue. Yet no source provided a definitive explanation. Instead, they deepened the mystery, urging me to look beyond the surface of this ancient land. As days turned to weeks, these oddities evolved into something far more disconcerting. My nights became a tapestry of restless sleep, punctuated by vivid, nightmarish visions. I began to experience dreams in which the redwoods transformed into towering specters, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to ensnare me. In these dreams, I saw a congregation of shadowy figures gathered in a clearing around a blazing, otherworldly fire. Their faces were obscured, their voices lost in a chorus of whispered chants, and yet the intensity of their presence left me with a lingering dread that I could not shake upon waking. I would awaken in cold sweat, heart hammering, as if I had just escaped from the clutches of an ancient, malevolent ritual. During one particularly harrowing night, the line between dream and reality blurred, in a way I had never experienced before. I awoke to a sound not dissimilar from that deep drumbeat, only now it was accompanied by soft, insidious whispers that seemed to slither through the cabin's dark corridors. I lay frozen, straining to discern their meaning. The voices were low and deliberate, uttering words that I could barely catch, fragments of phrases that hinted at damnation, betrayal, and a relentless hunger for retribution. In that moment, my rational mind waged a desperate war against the encroaching terror. I tried to tell myself it was merely the product of isolation and exhaustion, but deep within me, I sensed that something profoundly ancient was stirring, something that had been awakened by my intrusion into its domain. My initial attempts to rationalize these experiences through the lens of my urban planning background proved futile. The meticulous charts and blueprints that once provided comfort now seemed woefully inadequate in the face of an enigma that defied all forms of modern logic. In an effort to regain control, I began to document every anomalous event with the precision of a scientist and the desperation of a soul on trial. I set up recording devices around the perimeter of my cabin, calibrated sensitive microphones to capture even the slightest rustle in the dark, and kept a leather-bound journal in which I recorded every detail, from the exact timing of the drumbeat to the shifting patterns of the carved symbols on the redwood bark. I even took long walks through the forest at dusk, hoping that by confronting the unknown head-on, I might coax it into revealing its secrets. It was on one such walk, beneath a sky the color of bruise and shadow, that I encountered something that shattered the fragile veneer of rationality I had so painstakingly maintained. I was following a narrow trail that wound its way through the ancient grove when I came upon a clearing that seemed almost otherworldly in its silence. The air here was thick with the scent of moss and decay, and in the center of the clearing, a massive redwood stood apart from its kin. Its trunk was adorned with the same strange symbols I had seen before, but now they seemed to glow with an inner fire, pulsating in time with the distant drumbeat. As I approached, my heart pounding in a mixture of fear and curiosity, I became aware of a presence, a silent, oppressive force that seemed to press against my skin. In the depths of my mind, I heard a faint murmur, as though the tree itself were speaking in a language older than time. I placed my hand on the rough bark and, in that moment, felt a surge of inexplicable energy, as if the ancient wood were sharing with me its darkest secrets. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, a visceral reminder that I had trespassed upon a realm not meant for the living. The encounter left me shaken and haunted by questions. Who, or what, was behind these mysterious symbols and drumbeats? Were they the remnants of an ancient ritual, a forgotten deity seeking resurrection, or perhaps the malignant force of a curse laid upon the land centuries ago? Determined to find answers, I began to delve into the lore of the region. I scoured local archives, met with reclusive historians in small towns where time seemed to stand still, and even sought out a local medium whose reputation for communing with the unseen was well known among the few who still believed in old magic. Her small, dimly lit room in a converted storefront was filled with the scent of sandalwood and sage, and as she gazed into a smoky crystal ball, her eyes darkened with a solemn intensity. In halting, whispered tones, she recounted tales of ancient redwood spirits and malignant forces that dwelled in the hidden recesses of the forest. According to her, Redwood Ridge was once the site of mysterious gatherings, secret ceremonies in which practitioners of old, forbidden rites would invoke powers beyond mortal ken. The drumbeats, she said, were not the echoes of a natural phenomenon, but the pulse of a dark ritual, a reminder that the forest was alive with forces that defied the rational world. I listened, spellbound and disturbed, as she spoke of a malignant presence that drew its strength from the very roots of the ancient trees, a presence that would stop at nothing to ensure that its secrets remained buried in the darkness. Armed with her words and my own mounting evidence, I resolved to confront this malignant force on my own terms. I began to fortify my cabin, both physically and spiritually, constructing wards with salvaged materials and inscribing protective symbols on the threshold of my door. I experimented with old rituals gleaned from folklore, a careful blending of indigenous wisdom and modern necessity. Every night, as the deep drumbeat reverberated through the silent redwoods, I would stand in the glow of a single candle, reciting prayers and invocations that I had painstakingly learned from the medium's cryptic lessons. There were nights when the protective chants seemed to hold back the tide of darkness, when the drumbeats faded into the distance and the forest fell into a tentative silence. But then there were other nights when the evil reasserted itself with a vengeance, when my dreams were invaded by horrific visions of blazing fires and twisted, spectral figures performing grotesque ceremonies beneath a blood-red moon. One such night remains etched into my memory with a clarity that is as painful as it is undeniable. I awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, to find that my sleep had been shattered by a night terror unlike any other. In my dream, I was standing in a vast, open space, a clearing that stretched out before me, lit by the eerie glow of a colossal bonfire. Around the fire, shadowy figures gathered in a circle, their faces contorted in expressions of ecstasy and torment. I could feel their eyes on me, their voices rising in a discordant chant that spoke of ancient hatred and endless suffering. Then, from the heart of the flames, a figure emerged, a tall, emaciated entity with eyes that burned like coals and a grin that promised both damnation and seduction. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its malevolence seeping into my very soul, and I awoke with a scream lodged in my throat, drenched in a cold sweat and shaking as if I had run a marathon. The terror of that dream spurred me into action. I could no longer ignore the signs that my new beginning was imperiled by a force that defied human understanding. I intensified my research, scouring online databases, dusty volumes in local libraries, and even ancient manuscripts held by private collectors. I discovered references to a dark chapter in California's history, an obscure legend about a cult that once sought to harness the power of the redwoods through diabolical rituals. Their ceremonies were said to involve drum beats that mimicked the heartbeat of the forest, invocations that called forth entities from beyond, and sacrifices made in the name of eternal life. Though the cult had long since been disbanded, remnants of its practices seemed to persist in the very soil and bark of Redwood Ridge. The more I learned, the more I felt that my arrival had disturbed a fragile balance, that my very presence was a catalyst for the awakening of a malignant energy that had lain dormant for centuries. I became increasingly isolated, not merely by physical distance from the city I had once known, but by a deep, gnawing sense of alienation from the familiar world of rationality. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the redwoods, took on a sinister significance. I documented every incident with the precision of a scientist and the raw honesty of someone who had seen too much. I recorded audio of the drum beats, took countless photographs of the carved symbols that seemed to change from night to night, and wrote pages upon pages in a journal that soon became my confessional, a place where I wrestled with my fears, my hopes, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility that had been thrust upon me. Despite the mounting terror, I refused to abandon my newfound home. There was something about Redwood Ridge, perhaps the ancient, indomitable spirit of the redwoods themselves, that compelled me to stay and fight. I began to incorporate protective measures into every aspect of my life. I fashioned amulets from bits of redwood, inscribed with symbols I had painstakingly learned from the medium's cryptic instructions, and hung them from the rafters of my cabin. I adjusted my routine so that I was always alert during the vulnerable hours of the night, often pacing the perimeter of my property with a flashlight in hand, my eyes straining to catch any sign of movement among the dark, towering trees. In those long, vigil-filled nights, I also found moments of unexpected beauty, a kind of fragile peace that emerged amid the chaos of ancient power and modern fear. There were times when, after a particularly intense encounter with the uncanny, I would sit in silence beneath the redwoods, watching the interplay of moonlight and shadow, and feel a deep connection to something larger than myself. It was as if the forest, with all its secrets and specters, was trying to communicate in a language beyond words, a language of emotion, memory, and raw, elemental truth. Those moments, fleeting though they were, reminded me why I had chosen this path, not simply to escape the superficiality of urban life, but to rediscover a primal, unfiltered connection to the natural world, and to the mysteries that lie hidden in its depths. Yet, even in these moments of solace, the malignant presence was never far away. The drumbeat continued, its low, inexorable pulse a constant reminder that I was sharing my home with a force that cared little for human plans or desires. The whispers in the dark grew more insistent, sometimes carrying the sound of a mocking laughter, other times a plea for remembrance. I began to suspect that this was not merely an evil to be vanquished, but a spirit, or perhaps a collective memory, that demanded to be understood, acknowledged, and perhaps even redeemed. The more I learned about the cult and the dark rituals of old, the more I began to wonder if there was a way to negotiate with the darkness, a way to transform its malevolence into something less destructive, something that could coexist with the fragile light of human hope. I reached out again to the local medium, seeking a more direct connection with the forces that lurked at the edge of my reality. In a session held in her modest, incense-laden parlor, she closed her eyes and allowed her breath to slow until it matched the rhythm of the drumbeat that haunted my nights. "This force," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and fear, "is not entirely evil. It is the echo of a forgotten promise, a pact made long ago, when men and the wild were one. The redwoods remember, and they demand that you remember too. Only when you honor the past, with all its pain and beauty, can you hope to balance the scales." Her words, cryptic yet deeply resonant, stirred something within me. I realized that my struggle was not simply a battle against an external demon, but an internal journey, a reconciliation with the parts of myself that had been buried under years of urban indifference and personal loss. In the weeks that followed, I redoubled my efforts. I refined my protective rituals, integrating both the scientific precision of my former life and the ancient intuitive practices I had come to embrace. I began to incorporate meditation and deep listening into my nightly routine, allowing the persistent drumbeat to become not an enemy, but a metronome, a reminder of the primal rhythm that connected me to the earth. I learned to read the subtle shifts in the forest's mood, the way the wind carried the faint scent of rain and earth before a storm, the way the redwoods themselves seemed to sigh in the still of the night. Slowly, I began to perceive that the malignant presence was, in its own warped way, a guardian of these secrets, a force that could be both destructive and instructive. There were still nights, however, when terror would seize me with the force of a tidal wave. I would wake from nightmares in which I was dragged screaming into the depths of a burning ritual, where the faces of lost souls stared at me from the flames, their eyes pleading for salvation. I would lie awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft, relentless drumming of the forest as it echoed the beat of my own heart. In those moments, I questioned whether I had the strength to continue, whether the cost of remembering was too high a price to pay for a new beginning. Yet, with each passing night, I found a quiet resolve growing within me, a determination to stand firm in the face of darkness, to let my own light shine as a beacon amid the ancient shadows. I began to see that the struggle was not about banishing the malevolent force entirely, but about coexisting with it, about transforming its fury into a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The redwoods, with their silent, enduring presence, became my teachers. They had weathered centuries of storms and fire, their ancient trunks bearing scars that were both marks of past battles and symbols of enduring strength. I realized that if these giants could stand tall in the face of time and turmoil, so too could I. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of a late autumn evening, the deep, steady drumbeat still echoing somewhere in the endless expanse of the redwoods, I feel a cautious peace settle over me. I have not vanquished the darkness, nor do I claim to have fully unraveled its mysteries. Instead, I have learned to live with it, to honor it as a part of the tapestry of life that includes both beauty and terror, light and shadow. My cabin at Redwood Ridge stands as a testament to this fragile balance, a place where the past is acknowledged and the future is forged with equal measures of courage and compassion. Every day, I continue to refine my defenses, both physical and spiritual. I tend to my solar panels and generators with the care of someone who knows that modern technology can sometimes falter in the face of nature's ancient power. I repair the worn door frames, reapply the protective charms to the windows, and at night, I sit with a journal in hand, recording every subtle change. A shift in the wind, a new carving on the bark, a whispered phrase carried on the darkness. These notes are my lifeline, a way to keep track of the spectral conversation that unfolds around me with every passing night. I've come to understand that Redwood Ridge is a place of contradictions. It is at once a sanctuary and a battleground, a refuge for healing, and a crucible for confronting the deepest parts of our collective memory. The malignant force that I once feared now seems less like a demonic invader and more like a wounded remnant of a bygone era, a remnant that, if treated with care and respect, might one day be healed. I have begun to experiment with acts of remembrance that go beyond mere documentation. I hold small ceremonies under the canopy of the redwoods, leaving tokens of remembrance, an old photograph, a handwritten note, even a simple wildflower, at the base of a particularly ancient tree. In these moments, I speak softly into the night. I remember you, and for a fleeting instant, the oppressive darkness seems to soften, as if acknowledging my tribute. I have also reached out to the local community, sharing my experiences with those who still hold on to the old stories and legends of these parts. In quiet gatherings at a modest community center, over cups of bitter coffee and under the watchful eyes of weathered elders, I've recounted my encounters with the drum beats and the shifting shadows. Their stories, too, are filled with wonder and warning, a collective memory that spans generations, echoing with both hope and despair. In these shared moments, I no longer feel isolated in my struggle. Instead, I feel a kinship with those who came before, with the souls who once walked these redwood groves and left their indelible marks upon the land. Now, as the final light of day slips away and the redwoods stand silent and immense around me, I remain here, resolute, weary, but unyielding. The malignant force still lurks in the dark recesses of the forest, its drumbeat a constant reminder of the ancient power that dwells within these trees. Yet I have learned that I am not powerless in the face of such darkness. I have discovered that true strength lies not in the denial of our fears, but in the courage to confront them, to weave them into the fabric of our existence until they become not a curse, but a part of our story. So I continue my vigil here at Redwood Ridge, steadfast in my belief that even amidst the echoes of the Devil's Lair, there is room for hope and transformation. I stand as both guardian and witness, determined to reclaim my new beginning from the clutches of an ancient evil that seeks only to remind us of our mortality. And though the shadows may grow long, and the drumbeat may resound deep into the night, I will remain here, drawing strength from the redwoods and the timeless resilience they embody. I am Samantha Delgado, and this is my truth, a truth forged in the crucible of nature's raw power and tempered by the enduring light of human resolve. In the heart of the redwoods, where every tree holds 1,000 whispered stories, and every night is alive with the pulse of an ancient ritual, I have found both my refuge and my battle. And as I continue to chart this precarious path between darkness and light, I hold fast to the belief that while the past may never be fully vanquished, it can be remembered, honored, and in time, healed. Each night, as I settle into the silence of my cabin and listen for the low, relentless drumbeat that threads its way through the forest, I am reminded that life here is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the courage to face it. In that courage, I have discovered a strength that is uniquely my own, a strength that will not be snuffed out by ancient curses or spectral shadows, but will blaze on, a quiet flame of determination amid the timeless giants of Redwood Ridge. I never expected that the ghosts of my past would lead me into a forgotten corner of the Ozarks, but here I am, living in a small cabin on the edge of the Ozark National Forest near Harrison, Arkansas. I left behind a life that was once filled with the chaos of urban living and the bittersweet strains of music, a life where I clung desperately to memories of my younger brother, whose absence still echoes in every chord I play. I was 35 when I finally decided to abandon the city and its unrelenting pace, trading neon lights and crowded streets for dense woods, meandering creeks, and the promise of isolation. I needed solace, a place to mourn and to heal, and in the silent vastness of the Ozarks, I hoped to find it. The journey here was like a pilgrimage, a slow descent from the well-trodden paths of modernity into a realm where time seemed to fold in on itself. I drove along narrow, winding roads bordered by ancient trees and tangled underbrush, the world outside my window gradually morphing into something wilder and less certain. Every mile took me further from the familiar, and with each passing moment, I felt both excitement and an inexplicable weight settle upon my chest. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, a weathered, solitary structure nestled among towering pines and the soft murmur of a nearby creek, I was struck by its quiet dignity. The building, patched together with reclaimed wood and stone, exuded a kind of rugged charm, as if it had been waiting for someone like me for a long, long time. My first few days were devoted to the practicalities of off-grid living. I fixed leaky gutters, recharged the old generator, and restored a semblance of order to the place. I scoured the surrounding area for firewood and fresh water, each small task grounding me in a reality far removed from the sterile deadlines and hollow routines I'd left behind. There was something profoundly satisfying about working with my hands, about knowing that every repaired nail and every cleared path was a step toward reclaiming the life I'd lost. Yet, beneath the surface of these daily labors, there lurked an unsettling feeling, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind that this place held secrets I wasn't quite ready to confront. It started on an evening that seemed to come out of nowhere. I was sitting on the sagging porch, the sky above a tapestry of indigo and scattered stars, when I heard it, a peculiar melody riding the wind. At first, I thought it might be the distant call of a night bird, or the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. But as the notes grew clearer, my heart began to pound. The tune was hauntingly familiar, a lullaby my brother and I once sang together during the long summer nights. I stood there, frozen, as the melody drifted through the darkness, carrying with it an overwhelming mix of nostalgia and dread. For a moment, I wondered if it was merely a trick of memory, a bittersweet echo of days gone by. But deep inside, I felt that it was something more, a sign that the past was not as far away as I'd hoped. Over the next few days, I began noticing other strange occurrences. While exploring the overgrown thicket behind the cabin, I stumbled upon a tattered old journal wedged into a crevice in the wooden wall. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with spidery handwriting and crude sketches. As I read through its contents, I learned about local legends, a folklore of a vengeful spirit, an entity that some whispered was a Wendigo or something even older, cursed to haunt these woods by the tragedies of a lost family. The journal recounted tales of misfortune and sorrow, of a bloodline doomed by inexplicable calamities. It described symbols, odd markings carved into trees and rocks that were believed to be both warnings and invitations to the restless dead. I couldn't help but feel that the journal was trying to tell me something, that its words were somehow connected to the eerie lullaby and the quiet disturbances that had begun to punctuate my nights. Then there were the footprints. I remember one morning vividly. I awoke before dawn and decided to venture out for a walk along the creek. The air was cool and heavy with mist, and the only sound was the gentle gurgle of water over smooth stones. As I passed a cluster of ferns near the bank, I noticed a series of footprints pressed into the soft mud. Small, deliberate prints that were not made by any animal I recognized. They trailed off into the underbrush, almost as if they were deliberately leading me somewhere. My skin prickled, and a part of me, rational, analytical, wanted to dismiss it as the work of some unknown local creature. But another part, a more instinctual part, urged me to pay attention. I took photos, retraced the prints, and even marked them in my journal alongside sketches of the strange symbols I'd seen carved on nearby trees. Everything began to feel interconnected, a tapestry of signs hinting at a presence that was both ancient and sorrowful. At night, the boundaries between reality and the spectral world seemed to blur. I started to hear soft knocks at the door, as if unseen hands were tapping out a rhythm in sync with the distant drumbeat of my memories. Sometimes, when I sat in the dim light of my reading lamp, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow flitting across the walls, a figure that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only a lingering sense of loss. The most jarring of these experiences happened one evening when I looked out of the window and saw a spectral figure standing at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, a mere silhouette against the inky darkness. But as I squinted, I recognized something heartbreaking in the figure's features. It bore a resemblance to my brother, a fleeting, ghostly echo of the face I once knew so well. The sight sent a shockwave through me, a mix of terror and an inexplicable yearning, as if the apparition was reaching out to share in my grief. In the days that followed, I found myself torn between denial and a desperate need to understand these occurrences. At first, I tried to convince myself that isolation was playing tricks on my mind, that stress and loneliness were distorting my memories into hallucinations. But the evidence kept mounting. The journal, the footprints, the symbols, and that unmistakable spectral figure all pointed to something that defied my rational explanations. I began spending long hours at the local historical society, poring over dusty records and speaking with elders who remembered stories passed down through generations. They recounted tales of a family cursed by misfortune, a family whose members had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and unanswered questions. One old man, his voice trembling with memory, told me of nights when mournful music would drift through the forest, accompanied by soft whispers and eerie lights dancing among the trees. He spoke as though the events were a part of the land's soul, as if the very earth itself was steeped in the grief of lost lives. Emboldened by these revelations, I resolved to confront the unknown head-on. I set up a series of cameras around the cabin, positioning them to capture any movement in the dead of night. I also began to record audio, trying to capture the strange drum beat and the soft voices that sometimes echoed through the silence. I spent sleepless nights vigilantly checking my devices, each time hoping to catch a glimpse or a sound that would explain the inexplicable. My journal filled with meticulous notes, drawings of the symbols, and personal reflections on the spectral encounters. I wrote about the eerie melody on that fateful night, the footprints leading into the darkness, and the phantom face that so vividly recalled my brother's smile. Every detail was logged, every moment scrutinized, as I attempted to piece together the puzzle of Ozark Hollow. It was during one of these long nights that I decided to take a more active step. In the clearing behind my cabin, a place where the trees seemed to lean in close, sharing secrets in the rustling of their leaves, I set up my old guitar and began to play. The melody that poured out of my fingers was raw and anguished, a lament for the brother I'd lost and for all the grief that had accumulated in the silence of my new existence. I wasn't sure what I expected to happen, but as the notes echoed into the night, I felt a shift in the air. The wind picked up, and for a moment, it was as if the forest itself was listening. I played on, pouring every ounce of sorrow and longing into the music, each chord a plea for understanding, for reconciliation with the ghosts of the past. As the last notes faded into the darkness, a silence fell over the clearing, an almost tangible hush that was broken only by the soft rustle of leaves. Then, amid that stillness, I heard it, a low, rhythmic drumbeat, steady and insistent, rising in the distance and gradually drawing nearer. My heart pounded as I strained to make out the sound. It wasn't the mechanical thud of a machine. It was organic, as if it were the heartbeat of the earth itself, and with that drumbeat came something else, a chorus of faint, ghostly voices that seemed to whisper my name. I could barely make out the words, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable, a deep, aching sorrow that mirrored my own. In that moment, I felt as though the boundaries between my grief and the spirit world had dissolved, and I was no longer alone in my mourning. The experience left me both shaken and strangely comforted. I knew then that the presence haunting these woods was not merely malevolent. It was a repository of collective loss, a spectral memory of lives cut short, of hearts left in limbo between this world and the next. I realized that, in some twisted way, I had been drawn to Ozark Hollow to bear witness to this sorrow, to transform it into something meaningful through my music and my art. The idea took root in me, slowly blossoming into a resolve to embrace the haunting as a part of my own journey. I began to integrate these nocturnal encounters into my creative process, writing songs that were raw and unfiltered, lyrics that spoke of ghosts and grief, of memories that refused to fade. Each melody became a conversation with the unseen, a dialogue with the past that I desperately needed to have. There were nights, however, when the terror returned with a vengeance. I recall one particularly bitter evening when the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of lost souls. I awoke in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, to find my cabin shrouded in an oppressive silence that felt almost alive. I heard the soft knock of something against the window, a gentle but insistent tapping that sent chills down my spine. I approached slowly, my hand trembling as I pulled aside the curtain, only to find the darkness staring back at me. For a moment I was sure I saw a flicker, a pale, spectral face that bore a striking resemblance to the features of my brother. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me with a profound sense of disorientation and sorrow. That image, fleeting yet indelible, cemented in my mind the idea that I was not merely witnessing random hauntings, but engaging with a presence that was intimately tied to my own past and loss. In the weeks that followed, I became even more determined to document every facet of this experience. I meticulously noted the times when the drumbeat would begin, the specific locations where the footprints and symbols appeared, and the emotions that surged through me with each encounter. I started to feel as though I were part of a larger, ancient ritual, a reluctant participant in a dance between the living and the dead. I even reached out to some locals who still remembered the old legends, inviting them to share their stories over cups of bitter coffee at a creaky diner on the outskirts of town. Their accounts, full of folklore and wistful recollections, added layers to my understanding. They spoke of a curse, a tragic legacy of a family whose sorrow had seeped into the very soil, a sorrow that manifested in spectral drumbeats and ghostly echoes. Their voices were heavy with regret and resignation, yet in their shared grief I found a strange kinship. Embracing this understanding did not erase the fear, but it did temper it with a sense of purpose. I came to believe that my music and my writings were not just expressions of personal loss, but acts of remembrance for those whose stories had been buried in the shadows of Ozark Hollow. I began performing at local gatherings, sharing my compositions that blended the melancholy of my own experience with the eerie beauty of the legends I'd uncovered. Every performance felt like a small act of defiance against oblivion, a promise that these voices would not be silenced, that the past would be honored rather than forgotten. One cool, clear night, as the silver light of a full moon bathed the rugged landscape, I found myself back in the clearing where it all began. With my guitar in hand and a resolve forged from countless nights of solitude and sorrow, I sat on a fallen log and began to play a new song, a song that was as much a requiem as it was a celebration of memory. I let the music flow unbidden, each note carrying a fragment of my grief, each chord a step toward reconciling with the shadows that had followed me here. As the melody soared into the night, the familiar drumbeat began to pulse in the distance, growing louder and merging with the strains of my guitar. In that moment, I felt the presence of the unseen all around me, a gentle yet insistent force that seemed to join in the performance. I played on, pouring every ounce of longing, every tear shed in solitude, into the music. The effect was almost immediate. The wind stilled, and for a few heartbeats the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, I heard the voices, the murmured echoes of lives long past, intertwining with my song. There was no terror in that moment, only a profound sense of connection and healing. The spectral presence, which had once filled me with dread, now felt like a sad, old friend, reaching out to share in my sorrow and, in return, offering its own quiet forgiveness. I played until the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, and, as the song faded, I sat in the silence, feeling both exhausted and inexplicably whole. In the weeks and months since that night, I have come to understand that the legacy of Ozark Hollow is not solely one of despair and terror, but also of resilience and redemption. The drumbeat and the spectral figures remain, a permanent, if enigmatic, part of the landscape, but they no longer terrify me as they once did. Instead, they serve as a constant reminder of the inescapable ties between past and present, of the need to honor the memories of those who have been lost. My music has evolved into a tapestry of sound that blends sorrow with hope, each performance a meditation on the duality of life itself. I now see that my journey here was not merely an escape from urban chaos, but a pilgrimage toward understanding, a quest to reconcile the fragments of my own grief with the broader, timeless narrative of human loss. Every note I play, and every word I write is imbued with the spirit of Ozark Hollow, with the echoes of a past that refuses to be silenced. I continue to document the mysterious signs, the carved symbols on ancient trees, the footprints that lead into the dark underbrush, the soft knocks on my door that come when least expected. I keep a journal where I record not just the anomalies, but my own evolving thoughts and emotions, so that one day, perhaps, these pages might serve as a testament to the power of remembrance and the transformative nature of art. Tonight, As I sit here by the small, crackling fire outside my cabin and gaze out into the dense, starlit forest, I feel a sense of quiet resolve. The melancholy drumbeat still pulses in the distance, a steady reminder of the ancient power that dwells within these woods. But now, rather than cower before it, I embrace it as part of my own story, a part of a legacy that I share with countless others who have felt the pull of loss and the need to remember. I am no longer just a former musician haunted by personal tragedy. I am a keeper of memories, a storyteller who weaves the threads of sorrow and hope into a fabric that binds the past to the present. In the stillness of this night, under the watchful gaze of the Ozark trees, I make a quiet promise to myself. I will continue to honor those voices that have come to speak through the shadows, and I will transform my grief into art that shines a light on the beauty hidden within even the darkest memories. I will remember, and in remembering, I will heal, not just myself, but the legacy of Ozark Hollow and all the lives that have been lost within its enigmatic embrace. I am Dylan Mercer, and this is my truth, etched in the soft murmur of the creek, in the gentle rustle of ancient leaves, and in every note that reverberates into the night. My journey is far from over, and while the shadows may always linger at the edges of my vision, I have learned that in their depths lie stories of love, loss, and the enduring hope that even the bitterest sorrow can be transformed into a legacy of beauty.